Hear all these stories anywhere you listen to podcasts on the Let's Read podcast. A couple friends of mine listen to your podcast regularly and keep encouraging me to write into you with the story. Now, hopefully you find it as creepy as I did, because even though it happened over 15 years ago, it feels like yesterday whenever I remember it. To this day, I still don't know if I should have done something more than I did, and whenever I tell the story, nobody can give me a decisive answer of what they think I should have done either. So maybe you or your listeners can shed some insight or open my eyes to a new perspective. It drives me mad thinking about what else I could have done to help the guy in question in the story. Maybe because it ended with me being so helpless and useless to him. Now, for some background, when I was younger, I used to see myself as a bit of a wild explorer survivalist type. I had read all the books, seen all the shows, and kind of enjoyed having this air of rugged mystery to myself. I'm an extremely tall, broad fella, and combined with the sense of immortality you have in your early 20s, I felt pretty invincible. So all of this said, it's the reason why I spent a lot of my time camping by myself. One thing I'd say is that camping by yourself isn't actually the best idea. There's a whole bunch of things that can go wrong, especially if you're deep in the wilderness. If you need help, there's likely going to be nobody around to offer it, and if you come up against any adversity, man or nature, then more often than not, your body's going to be food for the crows, never to be found. Now, I've done my due diligence with warning you about the dangers. I can say that my years camping by myself are freaking awesome. There's nothing like braving it in nature all by yourself, knowing that your own survival relies solely on you and your decisions, and that one wrong step could send you spiraling to your doom, sometimes literally if you stumble off a cliff in the dark. Now, thankfully, I never managed to injure myself in that kind of way, which is a miracle when I look back at how reckless and stupid I could get. At the time, like I said, I enjoyed being a quiet, stoic man of mystery, so I didn't often recount my adventures to friends either. But when I did, they'd always scold me for being so irresponsible and tell me that one day I'd end up dead in a tree. Always in a tree too, according to one friend of mine who very much enjoyed the comforts of life. Not sure why he always assumed that I climbed into trees, but according to him, that's the way I was going to die. Maybe a leopard or something pulled me up there. I always laughed and brushed them off, and I don't think it really struck me at how correct they were until I found myself responsible for someone else's life. As much as I'd like to brag and tell you all about my death-defying exploits, it's this one final event towards the end of my camping days that really sticks with me. As I've said, I really focused on survival and isolation, so it was pretty rare for me to meet anyone else when I was out hiking. And so one day, 4 days into a planned 8-day hike, I was hella surprised when, almost out of nowhere, a guy came ambling into the clearing where I was setting up my tent. Immediately, I was on the defensive, being pretty much in the middle of nowhere and not having seen another living soul for days. And then, when I finally took in the guy's appearance, I felt more confused than defensive. Everything about this dude was wrong, at least in the middle of nowhere in the forest, that is. The main thing was that while I was decked out in full hiking gear, covered in mud and who knows what else, this guy was wearing what appeared to be a casual business suit. He looked like he'd just come strolling out of the office, at least in terms of what he was wearing. And the more I looked, though, the more disheveled I realized he was, and the more confused and scared he appeared to be. The first thing he said to me was to ask me where we were. I told him very gruffly and still on the defensive, and at first I wasn't sure that he'd heard me, because I have a tendency to sort of mumble and talk quietly. And then I realized his look of puzzlement was because he thought I was lying to him. We engaged in a bit more discussion, and I allowed myself to open up a little and accept that this dude wasn't out to kill me. I soon realized that he was very lost and unsure of himself. I kind of wondered if maybe he was drunk, but he also reminded me of when my great-grandma had suffered from dementia. There was this sort of glassy look in his eyes that disturbed me a little. Relaxing and deciding this guy wasn't a threat, I started being more gentle in how I spoke to him. I managed to coax the info out of him that he had no memory of how he'd woken up in the forest out here in the middle of nowhere, and the last thing he could remember was leaving work for about 4 days before. Either this guy had gone on the mother of all drinking binges, or he really was suffering some kind of severe head trauma. I tried asking if he could remember a blow to the head or anything like that, but he seemed completely unaware of anything that could have led him to where he is now. And let me just stress here for a moment, we really were out in the middle of nowhere. This wasn't somewhere that you could end up after wandering for an hour or so, or even for a day. And it really struck me how wild it was when the guy asked me for help in getting back to civilization, and we went over my map. Unless my wayfinding had somehow become way off, we were about 3 days from where I had left my vehicle in one direction, and about the same distance to the nearest town in the other. I figured that town must be where the guy had come from, and when I mentioned the name, his face actually brightened a little. He lived there with his girlfriend, he said, and he worked in the city during the week. Feeling kind of like an adventurer hero, I suggested to the guy that we camp out where I'd set up my tent so we could get some rest and warm some food up before we began the hike back to civilization the next day. It only struck me a bit later that I was inviting a stranger to watch over me while I slept, who could potentially be very dangerous whether knowingly or not. At the time, I didn't even really consider the ramifications of this, and like I said, I was young and reckless and arrogant. Thankfully, when I woke up the next day, the business suit guy hadn't murdered me in my sleep. He was in fact snoring in an extremely deep sleep, cramped up next to me in my one-man tent. I somehow managed to slip out without waking him and wash myself up, and then went about planning our most optimal route. I figured that I'd let this business guy sleep as long as he needed. We could even set out a day later if we had to, and I had enough provisions for probably at this point a year of survival, and the guy seemed to be in perfect physical health. Mentally, I wasn't sure, but I was confident that I could handle or wrangle this rogue businessman. But I prayed that he was just on something rather than suffering from head trauma or dementia. And after he'd woken up for the morning, it became clear that unfortunately this guy was suffering from some kind of mental issue though. He'd frequently drift off while talking to me, and his memory of lost events didn't seem to be any better than the previous night. Occasionally, I'd catch him looking at me in some strange way, almost hungrily or dangerously. And now it's probably obvious that I'm a stubborn idiot at this point, but at the time I refused to accept that this guy could be anything less than legitimate. Hell, maybe I'm only remembering these predatory looks by thinking back on it, I'm not really sure. But either way, I was at least sensible enough to insist that we head towards civilization that day. I loaned this guy some of my spare hiking gear, so he was at least a little equipped for the wilderness. And now that he wasn't wearing a suit, he almost passed as someone who belonged out there with me. And at the very least, he didn't unsettle me every time I looked at him. And as we walked through the woods, I realized that he was a surprisingly competent hiker. Too competent, it felt, looking back on it, but again, that just could be the benefit of hindsight. And as we walked, picking our way over some pretty rough terrain, the guy started talking about some fairly weird stuff. One thing that really sticks out to me was that he kept asking me what my views were on morality, specifically if I believed in an afterlife and what did I think happened to us after we die, etc. Again, looking back, this was really unsettling for a meeting with a stranger out of nowhere under these certain circumstances. Now back then, I kind of was pretentious though, sort of a wannabe intellectual, so I treated his weird conversation topic with sincerity. I guess maybe some of it was adrenaline and denial as well. There wasn't much I could actually do about being stuck out there with a super weird guy, so the best survival tactic I had was denial and to just keep pressing on. This guy really shouldn't have been able to keep up with me if he really was an unprepared, mentally sick guy who found himself in a situation like this. I'm absolutely certain of that now. At the time, though, He managed to keep pace with me despite being a lot shorter and smaller than me, and I really pushed us both through our paces. I should add, too, that the guy looked to be maybe late 30s, early 40s, and I was in my early 20s, so I guess there was a degree of wanting to impress my elders. And there was also the fact of being unaware of just how much difference that age gap should have made to his overall fitness if he was unprepared. After a day's hard hiking, I found a clearing that I previously camped in by myself and told the guy that we'd set the tent up here to take a break for the night. It was by a small creek, so it was a nice camping spot that I used a few times, and we both enjoyed a refreshing wash in the creek, and I settled in to share some rations with him. I hoped that by talking to the guy that I might be able to shake his memory loose, but all I got were these stories about his day job. Most of them sounded kind of made up, like he'd taken them from books or TV shows, but there was nothing I could prove to be a clear lie. The next day, after somehow surviving a second night sleeping next to this dude, we began again. Now I call this second day Predator Day. And thankfully not because business guy revealed himself as a predator, but because he became convinced that we were being stalked by one. Now I'd like to add at this point that the reason I continue to call him business guy is that he never actually told me his name, and I was too much of a hothead to slow down and really ask. And it started within an hour of us going out for the day. The business guy grabbed my arm and slowed me down. At first I got kind of defensive and thought, oh God, this is it. He's making his move. But I summoned my inner zen and I asked him what was up. He acted like I was stupid for not realizing it, but clammed up like it was some big secret. And then when I coaxed it out of him, he leaned in and whispered to me in a very exaggerated way to say that we were being followed. I told him we definitely weren't, that I'd trained myself to detect if I was being followed. I know I was kind of pretentious. I told you this already, but business guy sort of sneered at this and made as if he was going to say something smartass and then just didn't. Now looking back now, I'm convinced that he was going to say that I hadn't noticed him following me previously, but I can't be sure. I managed to convince him that we weren't being followed and to keep up the pace. About an hour later, he grabbed my arm again though and said something about how he was certain now we were definitely being stalked. Again, I told him we weren't, and I genuinely don't think we were. I asked him if he thought it was a person or a creature, and he said he wasn't sure. He said maybe it was a bear or a mountain lion, and I explained to him that neither of those animals were most likely going to be in this area, and that I definitely wouldn't be camping alone in an area with those kinds of things. Now the business guy sort of jeered at this as well, as if he knew better than me, and I reminded myself that this guy wasn't well mentally and I was just supposed to be helping him escape. Now some more time passed and the guy started really freaking out now. He was yelling for our stalker to come out and face us. He started shouting that we had a gun and weren't afraid to use it. Now as it happens, I did have a gun, a small pistol for protection, but I'd made sure not to reveal that to this guy at any point, just in case. I wanted at least one piece of protection for if things went south. At this stage, I was fairly certain that they were about to go south too with all the screaming that this guy was doing. He acted so convinced and certain that we were being stalked that it started making me paranoid as well. And suddenly every movement was a threat. Every noise was an animal creeping up on us. Sure, bears and cougars weren't super common in this area at all, but that didn't mean that there couldn't be a stray killer animal out of its natural habitat, right? And at one point, I just about had a heart attack when a rabbit went dashing past us, disturbed by this business guy's yells. Then I successfully managed to coax him into calming down and following me again, but this is where the guy starts to unravel. At the time, I assumed it was fatigue or illness affecting him, but sometimes when I play it back, I wonder if it was kind of a hunger. If this guy was planning on doing something terrible to me, and I stress that to this day I still don't know for sure, then maybe the itch to do it was getting under his skin. I don't know if maybe I was subconsciously thinking of this at the time, but I do remember that I pushed us real hard that day and we continued hiking a while after the sun had gone down, which again is a really stupid thing to do, but at the time, I insisted that we'd be fine to hike by flashlight. I knew the area pretty well and I also didn't want to stop while this business guy was still muttering about how we were being followed. Now, I'm fairly certain by the end of the day I was convinced that we were being followed too, even though I knew that that was impossible. Certainly, if we were being followed by an animal, it wouldn't have been able to stalk us unseen for an entire day. And finally, I allowed us to set up camp. And by my calculations, which were probably wrong looking back on it, we could reach my car by the next afternoon. I was feeling pretty pleased with myself at our progress. I was also still convincing myself that I'd saved this lost guy while ignoring all the red flags that I'd seen in retrospect. Or if not red flags, then at least pieces of evidence that proved things were entirely as they seemed at face value. I've retold this story countless times, and every time I do tell it, I remember something else I probably should have picked up on. And that night is where everything came to a head. We found a camping spot in the dark, as I said, which was a small miracle given how obscure the area was. My tent was one of those pop-out tents, so it wasn't hard to set up in the dark, and then go about setting up the portable camp heater that I've been carting around. No campfires in unapproved areas, of course. At least I like to abide by the rules. And we sat around that heater for the third night, and I tried coaxing more memories or details out of this guy. And for the third night, he continued to insist that all he remembered was leaving work in the city and then waking up in the middle of the forest. Now, by now, even back then, I was really starting to question this whole thing, given that this guy had managed to hike back with me just fine despite being allegedly unprepared. I figured that if he hadn't killed me after 3 nights, then he wasn't going to, though, and he had some other reason for wanting me to guide him out of that forest. It felt safe to play along, is really what I'm trying to say. Now, we were ready to go to bed to our tents when the men came bursting into the clearing with flashlights. One of them shouted at me to stay calm and that everything was going to be okay now. Meanwhile, a couple of other guys had grabbed the business guy and were now handcuffing him. I squinted against the light shining in my face, trying to make out who these guys were. Now, the way they were acting, they seemed like they were FBI or some other kind of law enforcement agency, and I think they were wearing unmarked jackets, though, or at least I couldn't see any identifying marks in the dark. The guy who'd spoken to me flashed a badge at me, which looked vaguely legitimate, but again, it was very hard to tell in the nighttime, and I also couldn't see specifically which agency the badge was associated with, although in later years I've identified it as being almost certainly FBI. Now, it was an absolute whirlwind. This one guy, an agent or whatever he might have been, was constantly telling me to stay calm and that I was safe, almost as if he was trying to distract my attention from whatever was going on with that business guy. I tried to look around the man blocking my view while shielding my gaze from the flashlight in my eyes, and it seemed like they were bundling that guy away through the trees, and it struck me later that business guy didn't even say a word or make a sound throughout the whole ordeal. I swear I can remember him grinning as they took him away, but again, I could just be adding that detail in my mind. Now, eventually, it was just myself and 2 of the agents, including the one who repeatedly told me I was safe. I expected them to, debrief me or something, at least explain the situation. But no, nothing. They literally told me that I was safe now, and that I'd avoided a terrible fate, and then headed off into the trees. Now, at the time, I was completely baffled. Of course, I didn't find out until later that I'd majorly miscalculated our entire route, so we were camping only about a half hour from the road. Finding this out later, it at least made sense how the men were able to locate and reach us, but it still left me with a few baffling and creepy questions. Who the hell was business guy? And why did he put on such a show of pretending to be a lost little sheep, if only to escort me back to my car? Was this the most elaborate carjacking ever? I don't know. And it also kills me not to know if the men who showed up were legitimate law enforcement or not. Either I got saved from some terrible fate or I handed business guy over to one. And over time, I've come to manage to convince myself that that guy had something awful planned for me. But that's only because the other possibility is probably too horrible to think about. What if I let a person in a genuine need get snatched up by God knows who? Now, I'm fairly certain that that guy was at least a bad player, though, because of a few things. 1, that night after everything had died down and the men had left, I checked my pack for security. Now, I was horrified to discover that my gun, which I kept in a holster in a hidden compartment in the bag, was gone. The so-called law enforcement agents never went near my tent, so the gun could only have been taken by that business guy. And as I mentioned, I never told him about the gun. He must have been searching my belongings pretty thoroughly to find it. Secondly, I discovered that the small amount of money that I kept in the same pocket was also gone. Now, it was only about $100 or so, but enough to feel the sting at the time. And thirdly, when I reached the car the next morning, after finding I was much closer to the road than I thought, I made one final horrifying discovery. I have no proof that this was connected to the business guy in any way, but someone had slashed one of my tires. Thankfully only one, so I was able to replace it with a spare easily enough, but it was almost as if it had been done as a delaying tactic just in case. Maybe to give that guy the time to jump me or who knows what. Some of my friends are adamant that I encountered an unidentified serial killer of women who'd been operating near the area for a few years before I camped there. Now, this would explain why he was so sinister but didn't kill me, although it wouldn't explain what his plan or motive really was. Now, I genuinely have no idea, but the more years that passed, the more I'm certain that I narrowly avoided something terrible. I just can't decide if that fate would have been at the hands of the business guy or at the men who showed up at the end. And as much as I want to, I can't convince myself that I didn't just let dangerous people snatch up a vulnerable man. And it's kind of weird to actually hope for the fact that you spent multiple nights sleeping next to a predator, but I prefer that than to think that I'd let him down. I just wish that I knew for sure. Maybe I'm better off not knowing. So let me tell you a story about how the best living situation I ever had turned into the worst living situation I ever had, and why there's never been a truer statement than never judge a book by its cover. So many moons ago now, I was looking for places to live in the city I'm at when I came across this pretty amazing apartment while going through the listings. The decor is awesome, it's all furnished, and it was maybe 15 minutes walk away from my job too, so literally perfect in almost every possible way. The only drawback was that it was a shared apartment. Now, I wasn't completely averse to living with someone, but I also knew that if there was a clash of personalities or something like that, then things could get pretty tense pretty quick. I'd previously lived with a guy, I'm a guy myself by the way, who could only be safely described on YouTube as a Neolithic savage, because if I go into any detail, I'll probably get this video flagged if you actually read it. Now, my point is, I knew that there was no point in me living in that place if the roomie was going to be difficult, and so I asked the landlord if I could meet him during the viewing, and that is how I met Todd. And Todd seemed like the dream roommate, honestly. He said he worked a lot and that he liked going to the gym and all of that in his spare time, but when he said that he'd be out of the apartment a lot, he wasn't kidding. I had the whole place to myself pretty much all day, every day, and the only times that I'd catch him chilling on the couch was when the game was on or when he had an injury or something like that. But even when he was home, I was stoked to have him around. He was a funny guy, he was clean, and he was chill too, so generally nice and easy to live with. But then came the night when everything changed. So the place had these 2 big bedrooms, these ensuite bathrooms, the works. Mine had a lock on the door too, but I didn't think that I'd need it, you know? Todd was a respectful and mature enough person to knock before entering and whatnot, so while I briefly considered using the lock, in the end I was sort of thinking, why bother? Now anyways, I've been living there for just over a month with absolutely 0 complaints all around, and the whole time, Todd was the ideal roomie. But then one night, I woke up needing to pee in the middle of the night like usual, and when I rolled over in bed, all I could see was this dark figure standing by the open doorway. And I freaking screamed so loud. I pretty much dived backwards off the bed, still screaming at the top of my lungs. Then by the time I grabbed the little folding knife I kept in the drawer, Todd had switched on the light. It was him, standing there in his underwear, but as weird as it might sound, he was just as surprised as I was. You see, Todd wasn't aware that he'd got up out of bed and walked into my bedroom because he'd been sleepwalking. Now, I said he probably should have just told me that once I'd moved in, but as it turned out, Todd hadn't done any sleepwalking for years. He said he used to do it a bunch when he was a kid, especially after he and his family moved house one time, and he figured it was probably the change of me moving in having triggered it or something, and said that he'd never had neglected to mention if he'd been actively sleepwalking. I just wanted to get to sleep, honestly, so I just told him everything was fine and then went back to bed. Now, the next morning, I texted him to say basically, hey, sorry if that was weird and I'm sorry about your condition coming back. I hope everything's okay. He told me we were good, but that maybe I should start locking my door in the future. I texted him back saying, sure thing, Captain Obvious, with maybe a laughing emoji, and then we were pals again. Now, from then on, I started locking my door at night, but it also wasn't like Todd wasn't doing anything about it. He said he went to some doctor who gave him a prescription for mild sleeping pills, and then for about a week or so, there was nothing. And then one night, I'm asleep in bed and I hear bang, 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 bang on my bedroom door. Now, once again, I'm just about jumping out of bed, but since Todd's knocking, I figured that he must be awake, so I asked him what's up. But I get zero response. I knew he must have been sleepwalking, so I called out to him to say, hey, wake up! All that kind of stuff, but again, I got no reply. I got up out of bed thinking, please don't make this a regular thing. And then when I opened up the door, there's Todd, buck naked, with his eyes all rolled up in their sockets so all I could see was the whites. I yelled something, slammed the door, and I think that's what woke him up because the next thing I hear is him saying sorry and then running back to his room, still apologizing. I didn't follow him. I was mad, but what the hell could I do? The guy had some serious condition. It wasn't really his fault. And so I went back to sleep, went to work the next morning, and then called Todd at lunch to see how he was doing. He kept apologizing for waking me up, but I made it clear that as long as he was seeking help, then it was fine. Because sooner or later the issue would be resolved, and that's aside from the fact that he couldn't really help it. He was super grateful, which was fine, because what choice did I have other than to work with him? And then again, that same sort of pattern played itself out. He went to the doctor, got more powerful sleeping pills, and even started hammering cardio at the gym after work to really tire himself out, you know? And there were another couple of weeks without incidents, and then once again, I woke up to Todd banging on my door in the middle of the night. I was just getting so tired of it by then. Almost every time we thought he'd handled it, it came back all over again. I started to suspect that he might not be sleepwalking, and that this was sort of like a weird way of trying to force me out. But I guess that was my paranoia and exhaustion talking because, well, I guess you'll soon see. And so he bangs on my door, wakes me up, and I start telling him to wake up and go back to bed. I put my head back down on the pillow and he didn't knock again, but I also didn't hear him wake up or walk back to his room, so I got up, walked to the door, and started listening out for him. I figured that he might have maybe quickly walked off to another part of the house, but I also didn't want to just open my door up just in case he was standing there naked again. And so as I said, I listened, and what I heard sent a chill run through me. Todd was standing on the other side of the door all right, and I knew that because he was whispering something. I knew it was just his unconscious brain working and that what he was saying probably didn't mean a thing, but just hearing him whispering on the other side of the door gave me the creeps big time. I ended up waking him up by banging on the door back at him, and it sucked to hear him get scared and frightened, but at least it let me know that he was for real. I started questioning why him knocking on my door didn't wake him up, but me knocking back at him did. But I guess it was sort of like the outside stimulus throwing him off his sleep rhythm or something, because, like I said, I don't suspect him of faking this anymore. Now anyway, the final time it happened, before I started to consider just leaving at the end of that month, I recorded it to show Todd that next morning, and I guess just so he could see things from my perspective. Now, he started hammering on my door again, and I tried waking him up by banging back, but for some reason that didn't work, and he started whispering again. Now, I banged a second time, thinking another round of knocking back might do the trick, but all that did was make Todd start speaking louder, and it was then that I heard what he was saying for the first time, and it was almost like a prayer, but all kinds of jumbled. There was a lot of, "Our Heavenly Father, Lord, hallowed be thy name," but none of it actually went anywhere. It was all these phrases just sort of looping and spiraling until it sounded almost like nonsense talk, just like an edge of reason to it. Now, he spoke in this weird voice too, like in the back of his throat almost, and I honestly think that it was one of the single creepiest things I've ever heard in my life. If I just woke up to that on the first night it happened, then I'd have been even more spooked than when Todd just appeared in my room. But since I kind of knew what was happening, I just went back to bed with a pillow wrapped around my head and tried to get some sleep. Now, the next morning before I left for work, I showed him the video I took the previous night. It obviously didn't show much of him, but it captured all the creepy-sounding nonsensical prayers that he recited in the back of his throat voice of his. I massively regret showing him that video, and I didn't do it to be mean or anything like that. I just needed him to see how serious it was and how bad he was disturbing my sleep. But oh man, the second he heard himself, it was like the stuffing had been knocked out of him. He went quiet. He said sorry, and then after telling him I'd see him later and we could talk about it after work, I figured that he'd head out the door like he usually did. Only he didn't. He just sat down at the kitchen table and he started to cry. Now, later that day, I got a text from Todd saying that he was checking himself into some kind of medical facility and that he might not be back for a month or two, maybe more. I had the apartment all to myself for a while, which was nice in a way, but I was really worried about Todd. We kept in touch, and I'd ask him how his treatment was going and all of that, but he'd always give me one-word answers and then change the subject like he didn't want to talk about it. I remember thinking it probably wasn't going well since he didn't want to talk about it much, and then after 2 months, Todd told me that he wouldn't be moving back to live with me, and he'd be sending someone over to gather his stuff. It was sad, knowing this super capable guy was having such trouble with a medical condition. I mean, it was creepy as hell being in the middle of all of that, and I think it'd have been a hell of a lot more frightening if I didn't know what was going on. But I did, and there was a rational explanation for it. It just sucked it was happening to him, and I lost his number after losing my phone, so these days I can't reach out to see how he's doing. So Todd, buddy, if you just so happen to be listening to this somehow, I hope you're doing much better, and I still think about you from time to time. If you go camping off the beaten trail in a bunch of places in America, but especially the Appalachian Trail, you're guaranteed to find some very weird things. Now, I have a whole catalog of strange sights I've seen, either in groups or by myself, but nothing beats the time that I stumbled across an entire set of dining furniture rotting away in the absolute middle of nowhere. Now, when I say the middle of nowhere, I absolutely mean it. This wasn't somewhere that it was feasible to dump your trash. This table and 6 chairs must have been carried for days through the woods, as far as I could tell, and would have taken a bunch of people to carry it here. And that's why it was so strange and unsettling. And the chairs were actually set up around the table, as if it had been installed here as some kind of picnic spot. Only, this wasn't any actual trail or any location that would be nice to chill and hang out at. It was just sort of there, in the overgrowth. The wood was all wet and rotten, and insects and crap were swarmed all over it, and it was pretty disgusting, and naturally, a lover of the creepy and strange, I loved it. The dining set might not have been a good spot, but there was a clearing a few hundred yards away that offered a perfect camping site. I decided that this was as good a place as any to set up for the night, and so I pitched my tent and went about heating up some stew on my camp heater. Now, later that night, I was lying in the tent completely unable to sleep. I was just taking in the sounds of the forest and the chill vibes of being alone in nature. This was my favorite part of the whole experience, honestly. At least, usually it was. That night, though, I felt the hairs stand up on the back of my arms as I heard a number of footsteps coming through the forest. Not super close, maybe a few hundred yards away, and you can guess exactly what direction they were probably coming from. I waited for the sounds to die down, then all I could hear was the low murmur of talking. I unzipped the tent ever so slightly and crawled out. There was a faint light coming from the direction in which I'd seen the dining table, and so I got my singular binocular out and tried to watch. There were 3 younger men seated at that rotting dining table, and then one older guy who I swear to God even had an eye patch. The night was near silence, so I could hear snatches of their conversation, and it seemed like they were playing some type of card game at the table, but they were also talking about their kills. They were very clearly poachers because they were talking about shooting and stealing deer from some nearby private land. And then I heard one of them ask something about what they were going to do with the other body. As I listened in horror for some time, it became pretty clear, at least in my head, that these 4 men had killed another person and were planning on how to dispose of their body. From what I could tell, the man that they'd killed was some type of family member, and he had it coming, according to them at least. But they were discussing the best way to dispose of that body. I tried to convince myself that I was wrong, that they were talking about an animal, but the more I listened, the more I was sure. And then I realized that I had a major problem. They had no idea that I was there, but if they found out, would they even hesitate in doing something bad to me as well? I had no idea what to do. I could stay silent and dark in the tent, or I could try crawling away to hide just in case. I knew running would be a mistake because they would almost certainly have firearms and knew the land way better than I did. And my God, I'm so glad that I picked the option to crawl into a hiding place. I dragged myself out of my tent and sort of army crawled across the ground until I found an overhang ditch that I'd seen earlier in the day. I tucked myself in there and covered myself with some grass and bush, hoping that even if they saw my tent, they would probably overlook me. Well, they eventually did see my tent, and when they went to look and eventually decided that I must have abandoned my campsite, I was actually surprised at how quickly they gave up because, hot damn, the way they talked about things, I'm 100% certain that they would have ended me if they'd actually found me. But nonetheless, I stayed in that ditch for hours, long after the men had left, just lying in that hole, too scared to really even breathe or step out. I had to pee myself twice. I'm not ashamed to say it, really. And eventually I gathered the courage to drag myself out of my hiding place and just hightail it out of there. As soon as I reached the car and could drive to a spot where I had cell reception, I phoned the police. Now, this was a few years ago, so finding cell reception wasn't easy, and I wasn't able to give the cops much. I didn't have a clear description of the men, and I wasn't able to pinpoint exactly where I'd seen them. They asked me to go into the local station, and I did, but they seemed more frustrated and annoyed with me than anything else. The cops promised that they'd let me know if they needed anything else from me, and I gave them my home phone number and email asking them to promise to give me any updates. Well, I never heard anything else, and in the years since then, I've scoured any sort of local news of that area in Appalachia for any news of a body being discovered. But here's the depressing thing. The answer isn't there was never a body found. Instead, bodies are found all the time out there. I have no idea if one of the many unidentified dead people who have been discovered in the years since were potentially the victim that I'd heard about. All I know is that it's very dangerous out there and you probably shouldn't go hiking alone like I used to. Now I know, you probably heard it in Zelda, but it is dangerous to go alone. Camp in groups, friends. Don't find yourself hiding all night in a ditch like I was. My name's Ryan, and I'm a grad student here in NYC, and I just managed to escape from the worst roommate I've ever had. I've been a fan of the show for a while now, and I've always kind of hoped that I'd never have a reason to contribute. I thought I could just listen to everyone else's creepy stories and never experience one of my own, but I guess that all changed when I met Kurt. I won't bore you with all the ins and outs of my housing situation in September last year, but let's just say that I needed a place to stay and I needed it badly. And so I ended up going to view a single room in a shared apartment where my roomie would be a guy called Kurt. And Kurt wasn't there during the viewing, and I'm guessing that not only was that on purpose, but the landlord had the place scrubbed down to make it look like a regular, sane person lived there. After some couch surfing, I moved in on a 6-month contract starting October 1st of last year, and when I first met Kurt, I had absolutely no measure of what a creep he was going to be. He seemed like a quiet guy, into his old-school heavy metal with his long red hair and beard, and I honestly figured the only issue might be loud music or something like that. But pretty quickly, Kurt showed his character. And the first thing, and probably the least creepy thing relative to everything else, was his music. He played bass guitar, and at first me and him were pretty cool, so I asked him what band he was into after hearing him play one day. Now, he was into much more extreme stuff, but we talked about bands like Sabbath, Zeppelin, and my personal favorite, AC/DC, for a while, and it was cool to find some shared interests. But then, Kurt asked if I wanted to listen to something he wrote. Now I responded saying, sure, go ahead, and then he gets out his phone and starts playing this recording that's just his bass line and a drum track. It sounded pretty cool at first, like kind of creepy sounding, but still pretty good, and it kind of reminded me of Dawn Patrol by Megadeth, if you know the song. Some vocals kicked in, something kind of weird sounding I had to almost concentrate on to hear, but then I realized I wasn't hearing anyone singing. It sounded like a young woman talking, and she sounded very upset. I figured it was some kind of spoken word thing that he was working on with someone, but then, as the girl kept on talking, I realized that she was the survivor of a violent, carnal assault, and that she was recounting her experiences either in court or some kind of police tape. I said, dude, is it real? And not like a sort of, oh man, that's cool kind of way, like, what the F kind of way. But Kurt just smiled and nodded and then started telling me about the exact crime it was from and things like that. I didn't say it to his face, but I thought using that audio was in very, very poor taste. But like I said, I didn't want to start an argument or cause any tension, and so I just palmed him off with something like, good art is always provocative, I guess, and then turned our talk onto something else. I only had to live with the guy, and I didn't think his weird taste in tunes meant that he was a serial killer or anything like that, but then I guess in that department, the thing he did next did him no favors. So I come home, I'm hungry, I open the fridge, and there's a bunch of what looks like organ meats in unlabeled jars, and the whole fridge stinks like vinegar. I felt like his stepdad or something going up to his room and asking him, like, hey buddy, what's that you left in the refrigerator there? It's awfully stinky for shared food storage, don't you think? Now Kurt's just sitting there, blasted out of his skull and listening to the Melvins, and while yes, the Melvins rule, they don't pair well with pickled organ meats. Kurt apologized, told me they were sort of not-so-live models for an art project that he was working on, and said that he'd have them out of the fridge by the end of the week. Again, this wasn't so bad because while it wasn't nice looking at a shriveled up pig's heart every time I grabbed some creamer, it wasn't affecting my quality of life or anything like that. But then, come the end of the week, the way Kurt chose to dispose of those organs pushed things to a whole other level. I woke up to take a leak at about 4 o'clock in the morning, and I had to be up at 6:30, so I'm pissed that I'm actually losing out on sleep. I hit the upstairs hallway in my boxers, breathing through my nose, all half asleep, and then bam, this smell like sour death just punches me in the nose. I can hear frying coming from downstairs, and so I kind of knew what Kurt was doing before I saw it. But I went down anyway to make sure, and when I saw him frying those pickled organs in a goddamn pan, I said, dude, what the actual F are you doing right now? Again, Kurt was all apologies like he always was. I promise that's not a Nirvana reference, but that time I was actually pissed off. Because once I went back up to bed, all I could smell was that sour death smell after it had gotten into my room. I couldn't go back to sleep at all. Like half because of the smell and half because of how mad I was that he'd try and cook that crap at 4 in the goddamn morning. It made him sick too. Like he pretty much occupied the bathroom for the next 48 hours, meaning that I was relegated to peeing in bottles whenever he was camped out in there or whenever I was too scared to witness the aftermath. And that kind of knocked the pep out of him for a while, I suppose, because there was no more weird behavior out of Kurt, at least none I could see. Now, the next thing happened maybe 2 or 3 weeks later when I came home to find a piece of meat hanging from some string he had tied to a cabinet handle, just sort of hanging there over the workspace. It didn't have a hook going through it like you might be imagining. It was sort of all wrapped up and tied in a string, but then the string had little tiny pieces of metal hooked on them, and so the meat looked like it had maybe 4 or 5 of these little metal tags on it. Each tag had weird little symbols on it that was different to the others. Now right away I'm thinking, Kurt, what the hell, man? And while I wanted to just toss it because it was a freaking dripping onto the counter, I just wrapped it up in plastic and put it in the fridge for him. Kurt comes home asking why I moved his meat and then asked me not to do it again because he was curing it. I asked him if he put any salt on it, like fully knowing that he didn't because I saw it, and when he said no, I said he needed to put a lot of salt on it if he wanted to cure it. Now he says, "Oh, okay, thanks." And then when I visit the kitchen, there it is again. No salt, no rub, no nothing. It's just there. I looked up how to cure meat, and what I read says you actually do gotta put it in the fridge while it's salted, and so at that point I'm thinking, okay, why the hell is he lying to me? I didn't want to argue with him. I like the quiet life, you know? And so instead of actually telling him what a disgusting creep he was being with his little hellraiser ornament, I very politely suggested that he keep his meat in his bedroom so he wasn't making the kitchen unsanitary. I also added that he was going to make it a safety issue. I had no choice but to contact the landlord. I wasn't a dick about it. It was more like, just work with me, dude. And since he wasn't a total a-hole, Kurt agreed to do just that and keep his meat in his room. The final straw was when the smell of rotten meat started seeping out from under his bedroom door. And then it wasn't long before I noticed an uptick of flies in our apartment. I got in touch with the landlord and asked him to perform some kind of apartment inspection so he could personally tell Kurt to stop just letting raw meat rot in his bedroom. He said he was busy for a couple of days and he would be over the first chance he got. But before then, I realized why the apartment was starting to smell worse and worse. It wasn't just seeping out from Kurt's door. He was hiding pieces of it around the apartment and letting it rot. He didn't get violent or yell at me when I confronted him about it. He gave me some evil-looking death stare, but he didn't say anything. He just slammed his bedroom door in my face, told me he didn't want to talk to me anymore, and at that, I called the landlord again and told him not to bother coming over, or at least not on my behalf anyways, because I wanted out. I still had to pay him a month's rent at the start of this month, but I honestly thought it was worth it just to get away from Kurt in that apartment. I think he's a scumbag because I figured that he deliberately hid Kurt's character from me, who, by the way, was having his rent paid by his goddamn parents. I also used to wonder how he could afford to live there without any discernible source of income, but on the way out, the landlord mentioned it and it all suddenly made sense. The same landlord actually offered me an alternative place to stay, but there was no way in hell that I was about to trust him again. Not after he basically tricked me into living with a freak like Kurt. So, I've got a quick story about the time my then-girlfriend kicked me out. Now, don't worry, it's not some psycho relationship gone wrong story, but it's about the camping trip that I took afterward to commiserate. Now, I know you seem to like outdoorsy stories, so I figured that I'd shoot my shot and try submitting something. This happened about 7 years ago. My then girlfriend, I'll just call her Erin here, was finally sick of my crap and kicked me out. I don't blame her. I was a hot mess back then. No jobs, no prospects, happy to just coast through life on her dime. And the only thing I was really passionate about was vacationing. The camping had been Erin's thing, and I was more into partying with the boys and going on spring break type vacations. But Erin had convinced me to try camping early in our relationship, and I was immediately hooked. I got to party and have fun in the evenings, but hike and feel at one with nature during the day, like it was actually achieving something. We had this one campsite we'll go to regularly, which Erin had been visiting with her family since she was a kid. It wasn't completely remote, but not super commercial either. A mixture of individual campers and groups dotted around an area that had sporadic park ranger patrols. Erin and I had our usual little spot, and that's where I dragged myself on my lonesome, tail between my legs. Erin had thrown me out and told me it was over, and I was feeling extremely sorry for myself. We planned the camping trip for months, and I convinced myself that I was somehow defying her and her accusations that I was codependent by going alone. Now, I'll also admit that I had the faintest hope that Erin would show up at the site herself, either alone or with her family, and we could have some big reconciliation. That didn't happen, obviously. A family did show up, though, only it was not Erin's. I was kind of surprised to find a car near my tent on the second morning of my vacation. It was unusual for people to camp right next to each other if they were strangers, and in all my time visiting that campsite, I'd never seen anyone camping in that particular spot either, because it wasn't exactly the best ground for it. But that morning, as I blinked and ate my way through a hangover, I watched as the Johnson family, as I'll call them, unloaded their stuff and set up their tent. I picked up that they were the Johnsons by sitting there in my fold-out chair, defiantly munching on sausages and staring at them in the hope that they'd go away. I wanted to make my presence as unwelcome as possible and either pick a fight or be left alone. It reflected the dark mood that I was in, and I'd come here to get away from everything, commiserate over Erin alone, and here was some nuclear family with 2.4 children and a perfect life. It felt like a kick in the face from the universe. I continued to watch them later in the day, looking over the top of the book that I was reading, and it soon became clear that they were far from the perfect family. For one thing, the mother and father barely spoke to each other. All I could hear was the dad constantly yelling at the two kids, a boy and a girl, and he kept saying things like, "The Johnsons do not conduct themselves like this," and "The Johnsons help each other," and "The Johnsons don't act like brats." The name wasn't actually the Johnsons, I forget what they actually called themselves, it was something similar though, and it started to give me a headache, hearing him yell at his kids in his high-pitched, nasally voice, and it kind of amused me though, to see how the kids just entirely ignored him. They acted as if he wasn't even there, and occasionally, when he'd really raise his voice, they might glance in his direction or even laugh at him, but for the most part they just sort of chased each other around. They only seemed interested in hurling insults at each other, these two weird little kids. Now, they must have been about 8 to 10 months old, but some of the crude things that they were yelling were way too inappropriate to share here on YouTube. And the worse their insults to each other were, the angrier their dad got. Meanwhile, the mom of the Johnson family sat on some portable sunning chair, the one thing that she'd removed from the car by herself, and just sort of watched. When the day started to get really hot, I kind of just was shocked and a little embarrassed to notice that she'd started sunbathing without a top on. The dad seemed to notice this too and saw that I was looking, and it stressed him even further. Now, I could tell that he wanted to say something to me, but he also wouldn't let himself. Now, for my part, I was in a bad mood and wanted to pick a fight, so I refused to be intimidated or move. And besides, in the language of the schoolyard, I was here first. And I started doubting whether I wanted to get into a fight with the Johnsons, though. The father got increasingly angry with his kids, speaking to them in a way that I'd never even heard a parent speak to their children before. And at one point, he grabbed the son's arm and yanked it so hard that I was certain that the son would react. He did react, but not in the pained and hurt way that I expected. Instead, he just called his dad some slur and ran off chasing his sister again. And the entire family was utterly and horrifyingly obnoxious. Well, I'd first thought the universe was taunting me by showing me what I could have had with Erin. Now I thought it was saving me by, showing me what I could have had with Erin. Childish, but I was directing my anger at her towards this awful family, sitting there just scowling at them while nursing my beer. Eventually, it became overcast and the mom got dressed again. The family built a campfire in their designated fire pit, the one benefit to the place I'd chosen to set up camp. I watched as the horrible children ran around it, getting dangerously close to the fire. Dad Johnson kept shrieking at them, threatening to beat them. The mom kept stealing looks at me and offering me little smiles, even a flirty wink. Now, I knew I should have turned my chair away or gone off to do something else, but I was being an idiot. I was also kind of enjoying how angry this father was getting and reveling in my role in it. I'd circled back around to the kind of drunk where you're happy to pick a fight and don't care who it's with. Only a few beers deep, but enough to be a dick. Now, this is probably one of the reasons Erin kicked me out. You could tell the father wanted to say something to me too, and I was kind of disappointed when the evening ended and he hadn't, and I was forced inside my tent by a chill wind that had whipped up. Now, I went inside my tent to read by flashlight and had to listen to the screaming awful children and the screaming awful father for what felt like forever. Now, eventually I realized that I'd drifted off to sleep and the campsite was silent. I needed to pee badly, so I crawled out of my tent and made an excursion into the outskirts of the woods. By the time the Johnsons' tent was silent, there was no sign of any disruption or trouble. I went back into my tent, suddenly freezing cold, and tried to go back to sleep. Now, shortly after, though, I heard yelling from the direction of that horrible family. I rolled my eyes, figuring that we were back to bad behavior again, but I quickly realized that the yelling and screaming had taken on a different tone. The mother and daughter both seemed to be screaming at each other about something that the daughter had done, and I don't know whether they were talking about the father or the son, but I'm sure that I'd heard the mother yell something like, "What did you do to him?" That one sentence made my blood run cold. I tried to summon up some of the bravado that I'd felt earlier so I could drag myself out of my tent and go over there to see if they needed any help. Then I heard a crack and a slap, and some more screaming, and decided that maybe it was probably best if I stayed put. I did have some cell reception though, so I placed a quick call to the cops to inform them that, that terrible family camping next to me might literally be killing each other right now. Now, helpfully, this dispatch put me through to an officer who informed me that the campsite was outside the local police jurisdiction, so I could call the park ranger for any non-emergency issues. I tried to explain that I was pretty sure that they might be hurting each other, but I guess something about my slurred words or delivery caused them to doubt me. Now, meanwhile, I tried to reconnect to the painfully slow 4G to Google the number for the park ranger, and on the next tent over, the Johnsons seemed to be shrieking at each other again, and one of the male voices had joined in that fray. I couldn't tell if it was the son or the father with how high-pitched and shrill the father could get. I don't know for sure, but taking into account the things that they were screaming at each other about, I'm almost certain that one of the kids had either killed the father or killed the other sibling. At least the mom seemed to think so, and was screaming at them about getting out of here and making things right. I know I was a total coward by hiding in my tent, but I cannot stress just how intimidating and horrifying this family had become. To this day, I've never met people like it, so I kind of just continued trying to call the park ranger while pretending I wasn't actually there. Eventually, it became too hard to ignore, though. The screaming died down, and through the wall of my tent, I could see what looked like flames starting to glow. Now, I was pretty certain that it wasn't the campfire either. That was it. And enough was enough. Time to insert myself into that situation. and so I dragged myself to the door of my tent and began to unzip it. I was going pretty slow, trying to delay the inevitable, and that's when I glanced up and saw the family's 4x4 light up and start gunning right towards me. And holy God, they were going to run me down and crush me, it seemed, and I would be absolutely obliterated by their vehicle. I managed to tear that tent open and throw myself out of the path of their vehicle just in time, and everything I'd brought camping got churned up under the wheels of this now speeding vehicle, and I watched in horror as the Johnsons, whichever members were alive anyway, went barreling off in their vehicle. I'm still furious at myself that I wasn't able to memorize their license plate. I called 911 again, and this time they took me seriously when I told them someone had tried to kill me. The cops showed up shortly after, by which time I managed to put the fire out that those Johnsons had left behind, literally, and the blaze that I'd seen through my tent had been their tent on fire. It wasn't as serious as it looked, and I managed to extinguish it with just a few water bottles and dirt. And as I doused it, though, I was almost certain that I'd seen a body in the smoldering wreckage, although whether son Johnson or father Johnson, I wasn't sure. I didn't see a body, though, so instead I was left to dwell on the sickening sight of that 4x4 speeding towards me in the darkness. I was extremely lucky that the driver, the mom I assumed, switched the headlights to a low beam. If they had been off entirely, then I might not have noticed that the vehicle was headed straight towards me other than sound. If they'd been full, then they might have blinded me. I run all the different variations over in my head whenever I think about it. It's the closest I ever come to dying by far. I'm not ashamed to admit that even 5 years later, I'm still in therapy over this, and it's the sight of that car charging towards me that I always end up coming back to. The rest of the story really isn't that interesting. I gave my story to the cops. They promised to keep me informed, and they never did. I have no idea if any member of that family died that night, and I do know that they would have happily killed me if I hadn't dodged out of the way at the final second, though. I don't know if they were aiming for me or simply forgot that I was there. I just hope it was the latter, but I think it was the former. Either way, screw you to the Johnsons. I hope that your horrible family was caught for whatever crimes you committed and you never had a chance to hurt anyone. I hope those kids managed to get the care that they needed. And the one silver lining was that my encounter with those Johnsons made me feel grateful that I was single, and I kind of stopped dwelling on Aaron very quickly after something like that. I'm still single to this day, and if married life is anything like it was for the Johnsons, then I'm happy to stay away. Hey Joel, my name's Phil and I grew up in Tacoma, Washington in the 80s and 90s. Now I didn't do great in school, so I dropped out when I was 17 and got a job working in a bar to get myself some money. I stuck around for about 6 years learning all the tricks of the trade, and then by 2006, I was practically running the place under the guidance of the old owner/manager. That place was my meal ticket, so I ran a tight ship. And if you ask me, we had the best bar in South Tacoma. Well, it turns out someone else thought so too, and that someone ended up making me a job offer I couldn't refuse. It's not there anymore, but there was this restaurant in South Lake Union called Gastropod. And the guy I served drinks to that night was the owner, and he wanted me to be the place's new general manager once the current one turned over his keys at the end of the month. And he was willing to pay me very handsomely for my services. I said thank you and goodbye to the old crew, moved up to Seattle towards the end of the month, and then spent the next few works getting over the imposter syndrome as I settled into my new role. Now I love my job, but the best thing about moving up to Seattle by far was my new apartment. Aside from the steep rent, there was basically no downsides to living there. It was a really nice neighborhood, and when I say it was quiet, I mean it was crazy just how peaceful it was. And that was in no small part down to my roommate, named Adam. And Adam was, in a word, a ghost. It actually took a whole 3 weeks after moving in before I met him, and I tried knocking on his door down in the lobby a whole 3 times and got no answer every single time. I was just getting home from work around 11:30 at night when I ran into Adam in the lobby while he was headed out. And the dude looked legitimately spooked to see me at first, and then even after I introduced myself as his new neighbor, he didn't seem to warm up at all. He wasn't rude really, just anxious. And after he said he worked in tech, I invited him up for a beer sometime, and he replied very nervously saying, "Yeah, sure, maybe," in a way that suggested that he was never going to do that. But hey, there are worse things than a quiet roommate, right? So I wasn't really complaining. And I lived in Seattle for a whole 6 months without anything to complain about, besides the rain, of course. Until one day, when my awesome brand new life turned into a complete nightmare. It started towards the end of March 2007. I finished up at work, said goodbye to everyone and locked up for the night, and then as I was walking along waiting for a vacant cab to appear, a black sedan with tinted windows rolled up next to me. I could spend like a paragraph or two describing the guy who appeared in the open back window, but nothing really sums him up better than Fat Bill Burr. He was bald like Bill, he talked like Bill, and he even laughed like Bill, and the only difference was the guy in the back seat must have had at least 60 pounds on him. In this loud Boston accent, he says to me, "Hey buddy, how's it going?" I told him fine, that I was on my way home, and then he says, "Well, why don't you jump in? I'll give you a ride." I told the guy that I'd rather wait for a cab, and then he responds, "You're the manager of that gastropod place, right?" When I said yes, he told me that that was what he wanted to talk to me about, and if I got into his car and went for a ride with him, I might just find myself looking at a very lucrative money-making opportunity, both for me and the restaurant. I hesitated, but he gave me this look and said, "Come on. What do you think I'm gonna do? Just get in, and even if it's a no on what I gotta say, you got yourself a free ride home." Now, I wasn't some nerd incapable of defending myself, so I got in, and we took off, and I listened to what he had to say. But from the moment he started talking, I knew that I'd made a huge mistake. Now, the first thing he said was basically, "All right, I'm gonna come clean. I don't give a crap about your crummy job, but you're in the car now, so shut up and listen." The guy's demeanor shifted completely after I got in the car, and I can't lie, it definitely made me a little nervous when he forcibly told me to shut up. And it wasn't just him and a driver either. There was a guy in the passenger seat looking around and very much mean-mugging me. And the guy started off by saying that since he knew where I lived and he knew where I worked, we'd be seeing plenty of each other in the future. And there was no point hiding or any of that crap, as he put it. But if I kept cool and did my job, then, like he said, there was money in it for me. All I had to do was find a way of getting into my roommate's part of the house so I could look for something for him. It was real small, and so small that he might be able to hide it in some pretty creative places, so I'd have to look long and hard if I wanted to find it. But when I did find it, the guy didn't want me to take it. He just wanted me to let him know that it was there and, more importantly, where it was being hidden. Now, I remember kind of reflexively saying, "I can't do that," to which he responded that not only could I do what he asked, but I would. He said I didn't look stupid, so he knew I'd do the right thing and do as he asked. I asked what would happen if I didn't, and the implications were clear. He said I'd recognize the thing he wanted me to find from the letters D-FNTL written on it. I didn't have to memorize it though. I don't even think it was those exact letters either, to be honest, but it'd be the only thing in his place with those letters on it, and then when I found it, all I had to do was tell him it was there. He left a kind of pause, waiting for me to say something, but all I could bring myself to ask was if he was, like, with the CIA or the FBI or something. The guy laughed and then told me if he was, he'd just arrest me and throw my ass in a cell, then threaten me with prison time till I cooperated. But since he wasn't, since he was a nice guy, as he put it, he was going to pay me to do it instead. On the other hand, He could make a phone call to some associates of his who'd head over to my place in the middle of the night and beat the location of the object out of my roommate. But he knew that it'd be noisy and messy and have the cops crawling around, and since I probably had my own stuff going on, I most likely didn't want that. Just to make it clear, I did not have my own stuff going on, and I'd have been more than happy to have gotten the cops involved there and then. But he had that whole thing covered with the next part of his little speech. He said the cops in Seattle were dumb and couldn't run a goddamn bath, let alone a city. And they were also more corrupt than an NBA ref, at least according to him anyway. And so if I talked to them and made any kind of report about him or what was going on with my roommate, he'd know, and there'd be trouble. Now by this point, I'm just a complete mess in my head, and all my energy was going towards not showing that. My head was spinning, I can feel myself sweating, and at one point I was legitimately thinking, this can't be happening. I passed out on the pavement and this freaking fever dream is occurring right now. But it wasn't. What was occurring to me in that moment was real, and there was no getting out of it. The guy even picked up on how scared I was after he directed his driver to take me home, and he started saying how I didn't have to worry about a thing if I just did as he told me. And there was no time limit on it either, since my priority was almost not alerting my roommate that I was going through his stuff. And the guy said if I spooked him, he might leave, and I really didn't want him to do that. If I did, he might leave and take that little object with him, which was something he would not allow to happen. I tried once again to tell him that I wasn't right for the job, that I'd mess it up and he should just find someone more professional. Now he responded with a pee-wee baseball coach saying stuff like, "Sure you can, kid. You're his roomie. I'm sure he trusts you." And he added that Adam, the name of my roommate there, might even have the object that I was looking for lying around on a coffee table or something. All I needed to do was head down there with a six-pack while the game was on and take a little look around after asking him to use the bathroom. I remember telling the man that Adam wasn't that kind of person, but he only said, "I'm sure you'll think of something, kid. You'll see." And a few minutes later, the guy was dropping me off a block over from my place, saying he'd be in touch the following week. I got out, just feeling numb as I walked back to my place, and then I spent the next few hours wondering what in God's name I was going to do. I tried asking the guy his name before I got out. I tried asking who they were with, too. I got answers to neither, and the guy just said, "It's not important." And then after asking me not to slam his door too hard, he and his boys took off into the night. I didn't even try to memorize the license plate because I believe every word of what he said about the cops. And even if he didn't have anyone on his payroll, they wouldn't be able to protect me from him, not in the short term anyway. And so really, what choice did I have other than to do what that weirdo said? And so I spent the next couple of days fixating on two things. Firstly, I wondered how the heck I was going to get into Adam's place without alerting him. And secondly, I wondered who the hell he was to have landed himself in so much trouble. All I knew was that he was anemic looking, worked in tech, and liked to stay out all night. And then if he was just some nerd, why not snatch him off the street, kind of like they did with me, and then get what they wanted that way? And if it was that important, why not just kick his door down in the middle of the night? Why get me involved? Was Adam dangerous, and if so, how? Those are all of the thoughts that were running through my head over the next week or so, and since I didn't know the first thing about robbery or burglary, I figured my best chance was to sort of fake a break-in. I could make it look like something it wasn't, and if the little labeled object I was looking for didn't move, then maybe he wouldn't take off with it. And I was still toying with that idea the next time I ran into the man in the black sedan. Now, I was walking in my car after work when I spotted his car, and while I'd been just about flinching at anything that looked like it for the past week, this was the real deal. The back door swung open, and I heard that same Bill Burr Boston accent say, "Hey buddy, what do you say we have ourselves a little talk?" I thought about running, but I knew that'd just piss him off, and so I climbed into the back seat with him and we had ourselves that little talk. At first, he asked me how things were going, if I'd made any moves yet, stuff like that, and I was honest with him. I told him I was still in the planning stages, that I was pretty inexperienced with things like that, and that he'd have to give me more time, a lot more time to get it done. And the guy kind of nodded, but added that he didn't have all the time in the world, so I should start making moves now. And that's when the second part happened, the scary part, because when I once again suggested that I wasn't the right guy for the job because I didn't have the moves he was referring to, and I was sure that I'd messed things up, the guy asked me, "So how's Annie doing?" Now the question had the color draining from my face. I literally felt lightheaded when he said it, like a damned bobblehead just trying to keep my head pointed the right way up. My heart started beating faster. I got that cold, sweaty feeling all over again, and try as I might, but I couldn't stop my hands from shaking, because Annie was my grandmother's name. Now, I didn't act like some tough guy. I didn't tell him if you ever lay a finger on her or anything like that. And I was just too stunned to speak, and I stayed too stunned until the guy reassured me that she wasn't in danger. He just wanted to know how she was doing. I didn't answer him. I just told him I'd have the job done by that time next week. And that's when the third portion of our conversation commenced, and he gave me a little advice. He told me to case the place, familiarize myself with it, and to do it soon. The guy then smiled, asked me not to slam his door again, and that marked the end of our second meeting. I thought about what he said about casing the place, which, for those who don't know, is basically the word criminals use for recon or scouting out or looking around. Getting a look at the place before I actually look for the thing would give me an idea of where everything was and where I most likely needed to look. And so, as strange as it might sound, I tried the idea I originally dismissed and showed up at Adam's door with a 6-pack of beer, some energy drinks, and 2 boxes of that chef's choice sushi. I figured I could pass the whole thing off as a sort of thanks for being a cool neighbor gift, so even if he didn't drink, I could talk my way inside with that good sushi that I brought. But even so, getting inside was no easy task. When I knocked on his door, Adam obviously didn't seem too excited on letting me inside. A few weeks back, I'd have put that all on him being nothing more than shy, an anxious person maybe, but right then, I knew there was something bigger going on. That didn't stop me from keeping my cool, and I guess that was down to me not having to pretend to be interested in him. I've been wondering about what he did, how he lived, and what his part of the house looked like for months by that point, and so I didn't have to put on some Oscar-winning performance to make that believable for him. I only really sold the idea of me coming inside by saying I'd basically never ask him again. All I wanted to do was get a feel for my not-so-new roomie, and then I'd leave him in peace like I usually did. He still didn't want to, and that much was obvious, but he knew that accepting my offer meant that I'd leave him alone in the long run, so he invited me inside. Adam's place was spotless. The decor was minimal and monochrome, and he didn't have a television that I could even see, and he had those 2 huge bookcases filled to bursting with all kinds of computer and tech-centric books. And after he put the sushi in his refrigerator, he showed me around a little, not saying all that much, but just trying to be polite, I guess. Now, I started asking about his job, and he said he worked mostly from home. But when I asked to see his setup, he lost what little of the friendliness he had about him and just said no. I tried to play it off like I was just being curious. I wasn't set on and expecting every nook and cranny, even though I was. But then, as I carried on getting vague non-answers to my questions about his job, I was looking around the room and seeing a lot of security cameras. I saw a lot. There were 3 of them set up around the living space and kitchen, all pretty sleek and small ones too. But that was 3 more than I had, and seeing as they made my job that little bit harder, I couldn't help but ask about them. Now, I turned it into a little joke, I suppose, asking if he was just paranoid or I needed that kind of equipment for my own part of the house. Adam just kind of looked at me like he couldn't think of an explanation and then murmured something about how it was good to be safe. He didn't seem like a bad guy, maybe it was just how scared he was, but I couldn't imagine him really doing much harm to anyone or really anything. He was just some computer nerd. One that had done pretty good in life to afford that kind of living arrangement, but a computer nerd nonetheless. And if the mysterious man in the black sedan was sort of like the villain of this story, then maybe Adam was the victim. And if both things were true, then I figured it presented me with the perfect opportunity to make myself the hero. Maybe the phrasing of that makes me sound a little up my own ass or whatever, but I can promise you, fear and the relief of having extracted myself from a difficult situation were also very strong motivators here. I knew that I didn't have it in me to get all Mission Impossible and break in there after deactivating his cameras and hacking his computer and blah 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 Hollywood nonsense. I had to talk to the guy. I mean, really talk to him so we could figure out something together. And it wasn't something I planned before walking into his place. The urge just sort of took me then and there. And when I asked him again why the cameras were there, and I got another non-answer about security, I asked if the reason he wanted security was because he'd taken something that didn't belong to him. And the second I asked him, the friendliness dropped away again, only that time he looked frightened too. He asked who I was, like who I really was, because I guess he figured I worked for someone. In response, I literally said nobody, absolutely nobody, and I wanted to stay that way too. And then before he had a chance to really panic or anything, I told him exactly what happened with the guy in that black sedan, and how he seemed to know everything, how he was threatening my grandmother, and how he was looking for something that was D-FN or whatever the label was I wrote earlier. No, I added that all he wanted me to do was report back on where I'd found it, and not to take it. And so whatever it was, he could just leave it someplace, tell me where, and then get the F out of town before the sedan man's goons showed up to collect it, it seemed. But because I was pretty damn sure they'd collect him along with it, and while that'd be rough on my conscience, it'd most likely be even worse for him. Adam agreed, and he actually got kind of emotional as he thanked me for telling him, but I was still very much in the mode of, we need to fix this crap, and now. And so I had to sort of hurry along the buddy-buddy moment and figure out what we were going to do and what was going on. Adam said he needed to copy what was on that drive, as he called it, and he also needed to erase and destroy all the computer stuff he had before leaving. And then including the time he needed to pack some stuff and arrange for some place else to stay, he figured he could be gone in about 12 hours, so 7 o'clock the next morning. And when he left, he'd leave that DF drive, that he called it, tucked behind the back of a picture frame hanging from a wall in his workspace. And that's where I could tell the guy that I'd found it, and since I couldn't do that until the next time I saw him, Adam would have plenty of time to get far, far away from Seattle. He tried to thank me again, but I wouldn't accept it, because it was now all on him to make sure our little deception wasn't uncovered. He needed to put that drive thing exactly where he'd said it'd be, and he needed to keep the hell away from the entire Pacific Northwest for all I cared. Because if they found out I'd helped him, then we'd both be screwed. Adam promised he'd disappear and that the men threatening my grandma would find what they were looking for, just not the only copy of it. And he only very cryptically reassured me that whatever was on that drive, its release couldn't be traced back to the agreement we'd made. I don't know if that was true or not at the time, but I guess me still breathing is a testament to Adam's honesty. At the time, though, nothing could have fully reassured me. And then after shaking his hand and wishing him luck, I went up to my part of the house, and in the morning, he was gone. I honestly thought dealing with the situation would be like a weight off my shoulders. After all, I'd done what was asked of me and located that little drive, so what else was there to worry about? Well, turns out a whole lot actually, because I still needed the guy in the sedan to buy my story and believe that I hadn't tipped Adam off before he vanished. At times I thought about vanishing myself because if this guy saw through my act, and he was probably going to do just that since he seemed to know everything anyway, then I was screwed. Even if they got the little drive thing they wanted, the guy would be pissed that I'd lied to him, and big successful criminals don't get that way by being nice and forgiving, do they? Well, a few days go by, and then lo and behold, I finish work one night to see that same black car sitting a few spaces down from my own. The back door opens up as I approach, and then I sit down in the back seat with that smiling jackass sitting next to me. I didn't have to act like I was sick of seeing him, and neither did I need to act nervous about the drive being where Adam said he'd leave it. So, all in all, I guess I was pretty convincing when I said they needed to make their move so that the drive would still be in the place I found it when they did. I remember saying something along the lines of, "I'm not having you guys blame me if he moves it. I did my part already, now leave me the hell alone." And the guy starts laughing that Bill Burr laugh of his heh heh heh, and then told me to calm down and that he'd make their move that night. He said I better go check in a hotel or something, that I should concoct a story about meeting up with a girl or something to that effect if anyone asks. Because when the cops got involved, it'd be easier for me to just say, I didn't see anything because I wasn't there. And the last thing I said, and I figured this'd be the last thing I ever said to the guy, was, "What about my money?" Now, don't think I was dumb enough to expect to get paid. I'm not that naive when it comes to the criminal underworld, but I also figured not asking would maybe raise suspicions somehow, so I did. Now, I'm sure this won't come as a surprise to any of you with fully functioning brains, but when I asked to be paid, the guy just laughed that heh 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 laugh of his and asked me why he'd pay me for something I just did for free. I took the guy's advice. I didn't want to make him think that I had a whole parallel plan going on, so I got the hotel room. And the next morning, when I made my way back to my car and drove home, one of the front doors had been smashed open, and Adam's apartment had been broken into as well. I called the cops, acted totally ignorant of everything, and just like the guy said, I was able to sort of say I didn't see anything because I was in a hotel with a girl that I met at work. And a uniformed cop later asked me why I hadn't brought the girl back to my place, but he seemed satisfied when I looked very sheepish and told him that we didn't want her husband finding out. And he gave me one hell of a judgmental look, but he didn't question anything further. I then had the landlord call me to ask me what the hell was going on, and she stopped by that same afternoon to take a look around. She seemed relieved that Adam's place was the only one targeted and that neither of us had been home when whoever it was broke in. After that, I thought that was pretty much it, that I'd somehow navigated dealing with some big-shot gangster without getting anyone hurt, and given enough time, the info or whatever that Adam got away with might get around to biting big fat Bill Burr on his freaking fat ass. But then came the night he and his boys showed up outside work again, in their big black sedan with its tinted windows. I didn't have to act or play pretend when I responded, I thought we were done. What else do you want from me?" But that time, Big Bill Burr didn't play pretend either. He didn't say, "Oh hey buddy, how's it going?" like he normally did. He just leaned out a little and then growled at me to get in the car before he had his guy drag me in. Now I knew that was the last time, I didn't. But that's what I told myself as I headed for the car. Just one more time, and then this whole goddamn nightmare is over. I thought it'd be the easiest one, with all the hard stuff having been gone, and I even figured that the guy might even see it good to pay me now that he'd gotten what he'd wanted. But that's not what happened. After I climbed into the back, and one of Fat Bill Burr's goons closed the door behind me, I tried to basically go on the offensive. Any kind of nervousness, and I might as well just write "I tipped him off" on my forehead with a Sharpie. But even after saying, "What do you want now, dude? You said we were done," he completely shut me down by saying, "I know what you did." I had to keep going. I couldn't just quit right there and then, and so I pushed back saying, "Yeah, you do. I risked going to jail for you, maybe even got myself shot. But here you are, still bothering me." I didn't get past the "here you are" part before they cut me off again. Told me the only reason I was still alive was because he couldn't prove that I tipped off my roommate. He admitted to getting his hands on that drive, the one with the DF code on it. But as I suspected, he wanted his hands on Adam too, and he was angry that he slipped through his fingers. He asked me straight up if I'd tipped Adam off, and when I said no, he just rolled his eyes and called me a lying sack of crap. He then told me that for my information, I should know that a body washed up on Alki Beach that very morning, and the cops thought it was my roommate, Adam. But Fat Bill Burr knew it wasn't. He said the reason the cops were so convinced it was Adam was because the body that they found had Adam's teeth. But it wasn't Adam, and Fat Bill Burr wanted me to know that the blood of that random homeless dude was on my hands and not his. And that was the only time I couldn't hold up my act anymore, and Bill Burr saw it. He then says, "Oh, you didn't think about that part, did you, kid? You didn't really take the time to find out who your little roommate was, huh?" I think I must have stammered or made some gesture because he seemed to know what I was going to say and anticipated it with, "You didn't need to know, so we didn't tell you. And even if you didn't tell him anything, you had one job to do, kid, and you messed it up." I remember telling the most unconvincing lie ever, saying I swear I didn't tell him. But all that guy said in response was, "Get out of my car," before reminding me once again not to slam his door. And that was the last I saw of Fat Bill Burr. I wasn't sure, and I'm still not 100% sure if this guy just sort of made all that stuff up as a way of making me feel guilty. Killing me was just more trouble, and I guess so was beating the crap out of me and giving me a real reason to go to the cops. But planning something like that in my head, a lie that I couldn't ever really confirm or disprove, I think that was supposed to be his parting shot. I'm happy to say that it didn't hit the target, not after a while anyway. I did a whole bunch of digging online and not a single body has been brought in from Alki all year, and the last being maybe 18 months previous to this. So Fat Bill Burr just had to have been lying, I think. Adam wasn't a bad guy. He might have done something dumb to have the mob on his ass like that, but I feel pretty confident that I'd done the right thing in warning him. I still feel that way, and I feel like I managed to navigate my ship through some very stormy waters, and somehow I managed to thread the needle in a way that saved both mine and Adam's asses. I feel pretty proud of myself sometimes, and it reminds me that taking the hard road and doing the right thing even when it's tough and scary is always the right way to go. But if I go the rest of my life never having to make tough choices like that again, I'll be a very happy man, and wherever Adam is these days, I hope he's okay, and that him and that Fat Bill Burr will never cross paths again. I'm a female listener in my early 20s. Before I start the story, I'll tell you all up front that I am safe, warm, and well these days. I have a long-term partner who I live with, and I'm no longer homeless or in any danger. That wasn't the case a few years ago, though. I was living rough, either sleeping out in the open in a sleeping bag, or for a while I had a small pop-up tent until it got all slashed up. I know some people prefer the term unhoused for when they were living rough, but not me. I know what I was. I was homeless. I did not have a home. I didn't have a community or a single safe place to stay. And it was hell. I hated it. I felt like I had to be constantly on the move, sometimes multiple times within the same night. And it was an extremely unsafe, unpleasant world for a young woman like me. And it's frankly a miracle that I managed to come out the other side of it relatively unscathed. Now, I genuinely do believe that it was a miracle, like someone was watching over me, and I had so many narrow misses and managed to scare off so many different predators. There was one incident that really stuck with me, though, and it was the closest I ever came to something terrible happening. It was the final day I got to spend with my pop-up tent. I didn't know that at the time, of course, but yeah. I was dog-tired because I've been walking all day, so I set the tent up under what seemed to be a remote overpass. It felt like I was in the middle of nowhere, as I'd been walking kind of aimlessly for a while, I guess. Now, I'll admit I was floating on some kind of substance I won't name right now, and when you're living rough, you take whatever escape you can get. I always tried to keep things very grounded, though, just enough to take the edge off. I had a little food squirreled away in the tote bag, so I allowed myself something to eat to lessen the gnawing hunger that I always seemed to feel. It was fall and fairly mild, but the weather was set to worsen soon. I was not excited about the prospect of spending another winter on the streets. I read a few magazines that I managed to find and a 3-day-old newspaper that I've been holding onto for warmth. The location that I picked seemed completely remote and isolated, and for the first time in days, I let myself drift off and drop my guard. Now, I woke up startled. There had been a loud sound from outside my tent, sort of like a bark or something. I heard it again and realized that it was a laugh, like a single, raspy laugh. And the laugh sounded like it was coming from someone very old. I could hear the telltale rattle of smokers' cough in their lungs as they laughed a third time. I had to make a decision: stay hidden in the tent and hope this guy moved on, or introduce myself and make it clear that I wasn't someone to mess with. I didn't actually have time to decide either way. Before I even had a chance to move, a very heavy body plunged onto the tent. It was almost like he jumped on me from a height, and I'm pretty sure that's exactly what he did. It was almost like some type of wrestler move, except I'd soon discover that he was just some dirty old-ass man. Now, he managed to come ripping through my tent fabric with some kind of blade. Now, I picked up on the blade first and was immediately on high alert. A fat hand holding some kind of box cutter burst through the wall of the collapsed tent, flailing towards me. I kicked out and managed to catch him by surprise, so he actually dropped the knife, I think. Now, the first thing I did was grab it and cut the tent wall behind me so I could pull myself free from the fabric. I scrambled onto the cold, dirty ground and dragged myself to my feet. And that's when I saw him. This huge monster of an old man who'd apparently swan dived onto my tent while I was sleeping. He was absolutely filthy, and he stank of, well, you can only imagine what homeless people stink of. And the whole time he flailed and wriggled, he kept letting out this single rasping laugh, too. There was a single flickering light under the overpass, so I was able to see a few details about this man. His face was completely scarred, and his nose was kind of burned away like an addict's. He had a cleft lip and his tiny, evil little piggy eyes. When he actually saw me, as in he saw that the inhabitant of the tent was a young, small female, he managed to get to his feet very quick. He had this look on his face then, predatory but also wary. I guess he knew that a lone woman sleeping rough can be hella dangerous out of necessity, especially now that I'd already gotten hold of his knife. And because of the way he was looking, I assumed that he'd case me out and be careful. But no. Before I even had a chance to realize what he was doing, this huge, stinking man barreled into me, crashing across the ground and pinning me to the floor with his huge belly. Now, his knife went flying out of my hand and I immediately felt my heart sink. No time to dwell on that, though. His bulk was completely crushing me, and I could feel him pressing against me in ways I really obviously didn't want. And since I'd lost that blade to defend myself, I decided to just try and punch him repeatedly on the side of the head instead. His head seemed to be his weak spot, I think, and after a few hits, I even started to see a cut, dripping blood onto my own face, and that stinking old guy was just howling. Still laughing too, though, like he was extremely high on obviously something. He rolled off of me and I scrambled away. The dude was rolling back and forth on his back like some fat turtle, and it would have almost been funny if I hadn't been so terrified in that moment, my heart absolutely pounding. All of my worldly possessions were in that crushed, slashed tent, so I couldn't just run either. I had to grab up my tote bag first, and no way was I leaving everything for this a-hole. I quickly ran across the tent and fished out my bag out of that wreckage. And just as I thought that I was about to get away, I felt some hand grab me by the ankle. I slammed to the ground hard, and I later found out that I actually sprained my wrist pretty badly, which was kind of a miracle to think that that was the worst injury that I suffered from all of this attack. The guy pulled me towards him, muttering something I couldn't understand in the moment, and I don't even think it was English. He didn't seem to be American at all, but I have no idea what language he was even speaking. Maybe nothing coherent. His mouth seemed to be bleeding from me cutting into his frail skin, and one of his eyes was sort of leaking this disgusting yellow crap. He was an actual monster in my eyes at that time. And this was my worst nightmare, the kind of thing that I dreamed about at my lowest point. There was no way that I was letting my life end at the hands of this disgusting predator, and so I swung my bag hard, hit him again in the side of the face. He tumbles backwards and I stomp down on his crotch with all of my strength. And then I just ran. And I didn't stop running until the sun was up and I was back in a populated area. Now this was the wake-up call I needed to straighten my life out. Now I won't go through all the explanations on how I did that because that's the non-scary part. Thankfully I did though, and in the time that it took to finally get a bed to sleep in, I never encountered anyone else like that horrifying guy. This was only a few years ago. I wonder if he's still out there though. It's not like I went to the cops or anything, as that would have been totally out of the question for a person like me at the time. On the other hand, he looked like he was basically falling apart, so I'd be surprised if he'd survived much longer beyond that. Now, maybe it's not very Christian of me, but I kinda hope he's dead. He was a monster who tried to suplex a sleeping woman and do God knows what, and I'm pretty sure he has nothing positive to offer the world. All he exists as now is the face that I see when I have the worst of my nightmares. Be careful if you're ever forced into homelessness, kids. Don't do drugs, as there are all sorts of horrors out there waiting. So I have this absolutely weird quick story from a time when I went camping alone. I guess it's not the most safe thing that you can do, but I did it a lot and still do. And this one event caused me to take a little break from camping by myself though, and it still creeps me out to think about it. So I was off the beaten track on a trail that I'd plotted myself out in the Adirondacks. I'd hung out in this area a few times, just reading and chilling, and not for a couple of years though. Now this time, I was 2 days into the 3-day trek that it would take to reach my usual camping spot. Now on the way, I saw some pretty odd things. Specifically, I saw a bunch of trees filled with holes. Now okay, you might say to yourself, some hunters have been using them for target practice. That's what I thought too, at first anyway. It wasn't really a hunting area, but that wouldn't have stopped some local kids from coming out here and firing harmlessly into the trees for fun. When I examined the holes more closely though, they didn't look like bullet holes. There was no splintering and not much breakage in the bark around them. It looked like they'd been drilled. Now I remember watching a YouTube documentary about a farm in Canada that makes maple syrup, and it reminded me of how trees get tapped for that. Now I'm pretty sure that these weren't syrup dispensing trees though, or even maples at all. They did leak sap, but it was normal, stinking tree sap that had dried in a few of the holes. Now, the further I went in towards my planned camping spot, the more trees that I found with the holes drilled in them, and I was super confused. Was this some kind of woodpecker, or maybe a creature? Now, the deeper into the woods I got, the fresher the holes seemed to be as well. Some of them were still leaking this sap, and they absolutely stunk. I have no idea what kind of trees I was encountering. I really wasn't all that into nature or like a nature buff or anything, but they absolutely stank of, well, how do I really describe it? You know the scent when you've just mowed the lawn, but you leave the cuttings out a bit too long and they start to sort of smell bad and maybe even weird? And then you throw some wet bark in there and maybe some food leftovers and make compost. That's kind of what it smelled like, but maybe more tangy. Certainly nothing like delicious maple syrup. Now, against my better judgment, I put my finger against the sap and licked a tiny dab from my fingertip. And it was freaking gross. Nobody would be tapping this to eat it, I imagine. Well, I was proven wrong as I made my way through the trees some more and saw the man. He was drilling a tree with what looked like a handle-operated hand drill. He hadn't seen me, so I crouched down and watched him from behind a trunk. The guy was drilling into the tree and then sucking the sap directly from it. After he'd inhaled a bunch of that sap, he'd throw his head back and make this disgusting lip-smacking sound. I felt kind of sick, knowing how plant-like the sap tasted. If the guy hadn't been wearing clothes and using a human drill, I would have thought that I'd encountered a Sasquatch or something like that. He was huge. He was tall, hairy, and he was sucking on a tree. That ain't normal human behavior, bro. And so you can imagine why I wanted to just sneak away and avoid interacting with this guy, right? Well, screw my life, I suppose, because I tried to sneak away very stealthily and covert and immediately stepped on a stick. And it cracked like a freaking bomb blast in that silent forest. Now, straight away, I heard the sound of thundering footsteps and turned just in time to see this tree sucker charging right at me. And he seemed absolutely furious that I'd been watching him drill and suck on trees. And yeah, it sounds funny to describe it, but trust me, it was not funny to have some huge angry man charging you down in the middle of nowhere. He was waving that drill over his head too, and all I could focus on was the handle spinning around. Thankfully, I snapped out of that daze real quick and managed to start running. The guy was intimidating and scary, but he was huge and slow, and I was young and fit. After a few hours of heart-pounding pursuit, I was confident that I'd lost him. I'd also managed to run off onto a different route and could no longer see any drilled trees, so I felt more secure knowing that I was in an area that guy obviously wasn't familiar with. I managed to reach my car and civilization by pushing myself pretty far. I took a couple of naps in some ditches, not wanting to set up my tent or do anything that could slow me down. It was a miserable and scary experience. And later, when I was close to the car, I found more trees with holes drilled into them, and that put me on the defensive again, but thankfully that sapsucker didn't show up again. I made it back to the car and hightailed it out of there, and I have not been back to that area since, which I think is quite understandable. Now, I don't know what the huge tree-sucking forest guy would have done if he caught me, and I certainly don't want to go back there and give him the chance to catch me again and find out exactly why he was even doing what he was doing. So, my name's Joel too, and in September of 1996, I was an 18-year-old gap year student living here in England. Most kids go into their gap year with a travel plan, but not only did I not have a plan, I really didn't have much money either. I knew that if I flew somewhere like South America, my money would go a lot further, and so initially, I was looking at places like Colombia, Peru, or even Chile, because it meant spending a few weeks somewhere exotic where the weather was nice and the food wasn't bad. But then, sometime in late November, I saw a news report about something called Visit Myanmar Year. Now, the BBC showed a big parade filing past some presidential-looking fella, but not a military one, and this was more like a cultural exhibit. Then the reporter talked all about how the country was opening itself up to visitors for the first time in years. It was this huge event, apparently, enough to warrant a few minutes on the nightly news. But all I found myself asking was, where the bloody hell is Myanmar? It turns out, Myanmar is what Burma changed its name to in the 1980s. It was initially colonized by the British and then became a big battleground between us and the Japanese during World War II. And then after a brief period of democracy after independence, the country's army seized power. And then, after closing themselves off for about 30 years, they decided that they wanted a bit of tourism, hence Visit Myanmar Year. It was billed as this untouched paradise of white sandy beaches and lush green animal preserves. Only trouble was, it had a wildly authoritarian military dictatorship that did things like use political prisoners for slave labor. I heard Myanmar's government had built half a dozen brand new hotels using that same unpaid workforce, which gave rise to a counter-tourism campaign led by human rights campaigners called Don't Visit Myanmar Year. Now, it probably sounds horrible, and I'd never visit a place like that these days, but back then, all I was interested in was how far my money would stretch there, not to mention being one of the first tourists to visit the place in more than 3 decades. And so when I heard that I could live like a king for as little as $10 a week, that was all I needed to hear. After a 17-hour journey, which included a short stopover in the Middle East, I landed in Yangon, formerly known as Rangoon. I didn't stay in one of those fancy slave-built hotels. Not even 5 stars of luxury could have swayed me into that one, I'm glad to say. But I did book myself into a nice little hostel near the city's Chinatown, which was priced at a head-spinning 80 pence a night. The British influence on the place is quite evident in a lot of the architecture, but Yangon also had some of the most incredible Buddhist temples I've ever seen, and the city's pagodas were something else entirely. Imagine a huge spire, almost 400 feet tall, and it's quite literally covered in solid gold plating. Then imagine how it shines in the midday sun in Southeast Asia when temperatures are touching 40 degrees in the shade. Needless to say, the Shwedagon Pagoda is one of the most incredible things I've ever seen, and since I was one of the first waves of tourism to hit Myanmar since it opened, I got a lot of stares. I didn't mind. In fact, I sort of knew that was going to be the case, so it wasn't a surprise either. Then after a day of walking around Yangon, trying out different foods and practicing my Burmese from the phrase book I'd bought, I made my way back to the hostel. It was a narrow side street, and it looked quite rough from the outside. But on the inside, past these 2 rickety wooden doors, it was actually really nice. The hostel's owner and operator, a guy called Min, was very proud of the place, and his wife helped do the cooking, his daughter helped with the cleaning and the laundry, and that was how they made their money. Min's English was really good, and he made me laugh when he quite deftly described his hostel as unassuming. And that was exactly the word for it, unassuming, because when he showed me up to my room, it was so much nicer than I expected. The place was spotless, the bed was small but comfy and clean, and while the toilets and showers were communal on each floor, there was no one else staying on mine, so I had a section all to myself. And by about day 3, I figured that I made the best choice of travel destination possible. Not just because the weather was lovely and the food was so good, but because the place was just so weird. It had been isolated for 30 years, and Myanmar still didn't properly open itself up until about 2011. So when I was there, it was almost like going to North Korea or something like that today, with the place having developed its own little microculture. Going to temples and all of that was fun, but it was a buzz just meandering around and soaking the place up too. At night, I'd open up the windows of my room and then work my way through a bottle of beer or 2, smoking cigarettes and just sort of listening to the city hum. But that's how I noticed how, late at night, Min would walk people through the hostel, out into the backyard, and into what looked like a small storage shed. And from my perspective, it didn't look like anyone ever came out again. I say shed, it was made of concrete and had this big iron door with one of those letterbox-style peepholes on it, but the structure itself couldn't have been any bigger than a garden shed. Min would walk them up, chatting like he was old friends with whoever he was with. He'd knock on the door, the peephole would slide open, and then so would the door once the guard or whoever was happy everything was cool. Now, I reckon that there must have been some stairs heading down into a basement or something, because one night, Min took around 20 to 30 people out to the small concrete structure. Enough to make me think that there was almost maybe a party going on down there. Then, the night before I decided to ask him about it, Min had caught me watching him from the window at about 1:30 in the morning. He stopped, gave me a sort of blank stare, and then just carried on walking. Now, the following afternoon, Min was at reception when I returned from lunch. Now, he gave me this playful look as I approached him and then said something about how I was doing a bit of spying that previous night. He wasn't confrontational about it, so I confessed that, yes, I had been a bit curious about what was going on in the back. Min said he hosted gambling nights down there. Nothing too extravagant, just a few games of cards played among friends for some pocket change. But then, being the curious soul that I was, I asked if I could join him one night for a few hands of whatever they were playing. Min laughed and said that while he understood my sense of adventure, he didn't care to mix business and friendship, especially not when there was money on the line. But I wouldn't hear it. I very crassly proposed that I buy my way into the casino. But Min wouldn't hear it either. And in the politest way possible, he insisted that I stop asking because the last thing he wanted was for me and him to have a fallout. Now, I took it on the chin. He'd been a great host and his wife's cooking was phenomenal, so the last thing I wanted to do was disrespect him. But then over the next few days, my curiosity grew and grew, until after the incident with the crying man, I could no longer help myself. I was doing my window watching routine one night when, at one point, the door of the concrete shack opens up and Min steps out with a guy who was crying. Min was silent and the crying guy was doing all the talking around his sobs, staring off in whispers at first, but then getting louder and louder until Min barked something at him and the man went quiet. Min then took what looked like a big roll of money out of his pocket, peeled a few off and then stuffed them in the man's shirt pocket. But the crying man didn't seem interested. He just kept whimpering things to Min in Burmese. Now watching on, I thought the crying man had lost all of his money or something like that, and that the backyard casino had way higher stakes than just a bit of pocket change. It might sound mental to anyone older than 25 because it most certainly sounds mental to 47-year-old me these days, but I just had to know what was behind that door. I mean, what was really behind that door. It took a couple of days for that blister of curiosity to really fester away in me. But when it reached bursting point, I went to one of only 2 banks in the whole of Myanmar that allowed access to international bank accounts. There, I withdrew exactly 1 million kyat, which I think was about 50 to 60 quid back then, give or take. And the teller gave me some really funny look as she counted out the cash, but I didn't care. My only concern was thinking of something I could occupy myself with for the next few hours until the sun went down and the night drew in, and Min started welcoming his friends down into that shady basement-looking place. Because when he did, I was going to knock on the door, ask to speak to him, and then offer him a cool million to let me in. I had this idea in my head that it'd be some wild Asian gambling den, with fellows smoking opium in one corner and playing ancient and indecipherable games of chance in another. And after seeing the shiny, happy side of Yangon for 10 days straight, I was ready to see its underbelly in the final few days I had left there. And so, around 1 in the morning, just like clockwork, Min started walking people out towards the concrete shed. I waited until he walked about 24 people through the yard, and then after chugging half a bottle of beer for some Dutch courage, I made my way downstairs and out into the yard. My heart was going a mile a minute by the time I knocked on the door. The letterbox-shaped peephole slid open, and an angry-looking pair of brown eyes appeared before their owner barked something in Burmese at me. I just asked, "Min?" a few times, hoping he'd understand. But all the guy did was slide the peephole closed again. Now I was left standing there, money in my hand, thinking, they're not just gonna let me in, are they? And I also reckoned Min might get so annoyed that he'd threaten to kick me out of the hostel. But the idiot teenager in me thought that it'd be a good idea to try knocking again. And I thought if Min won't come to the door, then I'd try bribing the doorman. But then no sooner had I knocked, it swung right open, and I was faced with a very angry-looking Min. Now, it was very frightening to be honest, seeing this kindly Burmese bloke suddenly turn on me. And I honestly had no idea what to say, and so I did the only thing I could think of, held out the wad of cash, and told him he could have it if he'd let me into the casino. I honestly thought it was the money that had changed his mind, but when he finally did relent, he told me to put my money away and save it for betting. I was elated, but then Min suddenly threatened me with what he'd do if I didn't stay quiet about what I saw. He said if I went to the police to talk about what I'd seen down there, he'd arrange for them to find some pills in my luggage. He didn't specify what kind of pills, but he didn't have to. I knew what he was getting at. If I grassed him up, he'd have to punish me. But if gambling wasn't completely restricted in Myanmar and Min's little backyard casino wasn't illegal since he wasn't profiting from it, then what the hell was he threatening me for? I didn't dwell on that though, I couldn't. Min was standing right in front of me waiting for an answer. And I told him that I accepted his conditions. and that I wouldn't breathe a word of what I'd seen. I neglected to mention that I intended on telling everyone once I got back home because, of course, I was going to regale them with the tales of my adventures. I just wouldn't say anything to the Burmese police. But then, in what I consider to be a very delicious twist of irony, it was years before I was able to talk to anyone about what I saw that night. Min gave me this look, like he was weighing up his options and weighing me up a bit too. And then after telling me to follow him, we walked past that big iron door together and down a long flight of winding stairs. I stayed close behind Min, with the guard giving me all kinds of funny looks as I passed him. We walked down steps for what felt like a couple of minutes before the stairs stopped and we were faced with another corridor. At the end of it was another thick door, and from behind it, I could hear muffled sounds of shouting and commotion. Min turned to me before he opened and asked if I was sure I wanted to enter. And while it seems so bizarre to me looking back on it all these years, there wasn't anything I wanted more. When I said yes, I thought he might give me a smile of approval or something, but he didn't. He kept this steely look on his face and then turned and cranked the handle of the big iron door. The second Min pulled it open, I realized that it must have been soundproofed or something because I was hit with what I can only describe as a wave of sound. I'd seen Min welcome about 24 people into the shed, but down in the actual basement, there must have been more than 100 people, all surrounding what looked to be a dogfighting ring. I realized that there must have been multiple entrances too, and that Min's was just one of a network of entrances that led down into a space the size of maybe a secondary school gymnasium. But before I could really take in what I was seeing, Min told me to follow him again. As we weaved through the crowd, it was like every single person turned to look at me. They were positively flabbergasted to see a foreigner in their midst, and I can't say I blame them. I imagine I looked pretty shocked too, especially when I looked down into the little ring in the center and saw a guy hosing what looked like blood into a sewer grate. I couldn't stare for long. I had to keep an eye on Min in front of me as he took us towards a collection of bookmakers. I was convinced I was about to witness either a cockfight or a dogfight. Now imagine my surprise when two young Burmese men were led into the pit, one with a white headband and one with a black headband. Min smiled for the first time and shouted, just in time, to be heard over the noise of the crowd. Some of them rushed to the edge of the pit, staring intently at each man, and then a veritable frenzy of betting kicked off next to us. And then once the crowd thinned out a bit, Min asked who I wanted to bet on, black headband or white headband. I told him it was hard to place a bet without knowing what they were about to do, but Min told me it didn't matter. They were about to play a game of chance, not a game of skill or test of strength, and while some gamblers claimed that they could see the winner before the game was even played, Min assured me that that was nonsense. As I handed Min 10,000 kyat, I asked him which contestant he recommended, and without a beat, he said black headband. Then as I watched him hand the money over to the bookmaker and I placed my bet, I started to be reminded of a film I'd watched some time before, a little film called The Deer Hunter. I remember watching the film thinking, no way does that actually happen, and I had a similar thought in that big, loud basement. I asked Min the name of the game that they'd be playing, and I hoped that he'd name some sort of local blood sport. But when he turned to me, raising his voice again to be heard over the crowd, he confirmed my deepest, darkest fears when he said, Russian roulette. I was stunned. I mean, absolutely gobsmacked. But I made a right tit of myself because all I could think to say to Min was, this is just like The Deer Hunter. Obviously, Min hadn't seen that movie. He hadn't even heard of it. And so he gave me this funny look and asked me to repeat myself. I told him it didn't matter, and looking back on it, I think that was some attempt to disassociate from what was actually happening. And then, when everything went down, that it was all actually real, I realized what a huge mistake I'd made. I didn't want to see anyone get their head blown off in front of me, but at the same time I knew that turning to Min and immediately saying, I want to leave, would only make him furious. He'd warned me on multiple occasions not to get involved, so instead of making even more of an idiot of myself, I kept my mouth shut and watched the game unfold. I thought the organizers might go grab each man a chair and a table to put between them, but they didn't. I mean, why would they? It wasn't a movie. They didn't need to conceal tubes that made blood squirt out of Christopher Walken's head. The only kind of theatrical thing that happened was when the, I suppose you might call him referee, walked around the edge of the pit, showing everyone how the bullets in the gun weren't fakes or anything. He walked slowly, shouting something in Burmese every so often, and then once he'd completed the full loop, the two contestants stepped face to face with one another. The referee shouted something, and then everyone went quiet. He then flipped a coin, before presumably asking one of the contestants heads or tails. They answered, the ref checked the coin, and then after a word from the contestant, the ref handed the revolver to his opposite number, meaning the man in the black headband would pull the trigger first. It was easily the most surreal and frightening experiences of my entire life, thinking to myself, this can't be happening, while my inner monologue screamed, but it is, and you need to leave right now. But I couldn't. I'd made my bid and now I had to sleep in it. The referee put one bullet in the revolver, and after spinning the cylinder around and around, he slammed it shut and handed it to Black Headband. And then the whole place went from raucous to silence in the time that it took for the young man to raise the gun. I could see him shaking, and then after scrunching his eyes closed, he pulled the trigger. Yet nothing but a dull click was heard. The room erupted, with people cheering or shouting, and men explained how all kinds of bets were made on when or who or if. But the rules were that each man took 5 shots and the cylinder was spun before each and every one. If someone died, they died. But more often than not, they didn't. It wasn't like fictional depictions of Russian roulette I've seen where someone's demise seems like the absolute goal. The crowd were just gambling, albeit in a very high-stakes environment, and the contestants stood to gain a lot too. They could bet on their own survival or their opponent's death. Some even bet on themselves to die, as it meant their family got a bit of money if they did. But I've also no doubt that there were people there who wanted to see someone get their head blown off, and I think Min was one of them. When the man in the white headband put the revolver to his head, the room went quiet again. And then after a second dull click, the cycle repeated itself. The room went crazy. The revolver's cylinder was spun, and then it was handed back to the man with the black headband, but once again, pulling the trigger yielded nothing but a dull click. I actually started to relax a little bit as each man completed his 4th trigger pull without a shot. I'd once been convinced I was about to watch someone die, but just like Min said, it seemed like it was actually kind of a rare event that someone was killed playing with just 1 bullet. It was still horrifying to witness those guys doing what they were doing. I just didn't feel like I wanted to run anymore. But then, as the man in the black headband was due to take his final shot, it looked like he was hesitating. Both contestants were shaking pretty heavily by trigger pulls 4 and 5, but Black Headband was shaking like a leaf by his 5th attempt. Now I thought he was psyching himself up to finish the game, but after shaking and scrunching his eyes closed just like he did the first time, his hand dropped away from the side of his head, and he whined something in Burmese that could have been, "I can't." And the crowd went ballistic, not with cheers this time, but with anger. And as the referee began shouting something at Black Headband, 2 bigger guys, who were obviously security of some kind, jumped into the pit to join them. Black Headband put the gun to his temple again, but again he failed to pull the trigger. I started wondering what might happen in this sort of situation, but was quickly provided an answer. The 2 security guards rushed Black Headband, pinning him to the concrete floor. I thought he might try and shoot them as they rushed him, but he didn't. He just dropped the gun and then backed up with his hands raised like he was pleading with them. Seconds later, he was pinned, and then they held him there while the referee picked up the gun. The ref shouted something at the crowd, who immediately fell silent, and then he put the revolver right against Black Headband's forehead and pulled the trigger. But once again, it was nothing but a dull click. The crowd burst into cheers and laughter that Black Headband had been scared of an empty chamber. Even White Headband was laughing, and he stayed laughing as the referee spun the revolver cylinder one final time before handing it to him. Black Headband was lying on the floor in a puddle of shame, quite literally too, since he actually peed his pants around the time the referee put the gun to his head. Then, White Headband raised the gun, and the crowd fell silent again. He was still chuckling at Black Headband as he pulled the trigger. Then bang! His skull all but disintegrated. If you think the crowd might have reacted any differently than before, with any bloodthirst for example, they didn't. White Headband's head exploding was nothing more than something that won or lost them money. Some cursed, others cheered and waved their betting slips in the air. But me, all I could do was stand there, staring at what remained of White Headband's head until finally I heard Min in my ear saying, "Congratulations, you won." And that was the second time I saw him smile, when realizing I'd made a terrible mistake as it was written all over my face. He told me to follow him so I could collect my winnings, and then once I'd shoved that big bundle of blood money into my pocket, Min was still smiling as he asked me, "Have you seen enough?" When we were outside again, walking back across the yard, Min reminded me of what had happened if I told people what I'd seen. Not in a rude or overly intimidating way, he just asked if I remembered our arrangement regarding discretion. And when I said yes, he didn't say anything else until we parted ways. He wished me a good night, but I was in no mood to sleep. Instead, I went out drinking, and I ended up giving away that blood money in pieces to a series of beggars I encountered, and I drank until I could only stagger and then almost got myself arrested when I tried to sleep on the steps of a temple I found myself at. The police drove me back to the hostel, and thankfully the reception was deserted, and then I staggered up to my room and crashed out on the bed. The next morning's hangover was abominable, and it wasn't until about lunchtime that I stopped vomiting and was able to keep water down. I wanted to pretend the whole thing had never happened, and apparently Min was only too happy to oblige me, because when I finally trudged downstairs to get some of the in-house food, Min was just as warm and cheerful as ever. I ate in silence, and then went back up to my room to sleep off the rest of my hangover. And then in the evening, I went to a Buddhist temple and stayed there until late at night. Now, I won't get into everything I meditated over. I'm sure you can all probably guess the kinds of things that I was thinking about, but I'll just say that I realized for the first time in my life just how full of darkness and horror the world really is, and how sheltered I'd been from growing up in the leafy green suburbs of England. Growing up, I wasn't a small kid. No, I'm not going to be ashamed to say it. I was fat. Medically, I qualified as obese, and I suffered from some pretty severe depression following my parents' divorce. There was an emptiness in my life when my mom went off and left us, and I filled the void with food. I'm not that person anymore, but I'm not going to be ashamed that I was either. That's the kind of thing that leads down the path that I followed in the first place. And by the time I started high school, I weighed way over 200 pounds and I was very big. I hated gym class and I dreaded the showers even more. It's not like everyone in my grade was some jock or anything like that, but I was by far the biggest boy in freshman year. The only upside to it is that I was a tough little guy as well. The bullies soon gave up on any kind of physical violence against me because I could take it. Shove me against the lockers, I'd just bounce back. Literally too, I guess. Slap my fat rolls, I had a very high pain threshold. Call me fat? Well, yeah, I knew I was. I could hardly deny it. I didn't love hearing it, but just pointing out that I was a big boy only stung internally. And so yeah, I was bullied and it did upset me, but I was great at not showing it, and I think a lot of the kids respected that. There was one kid though. His name was Neil, and he was as skinny as I was fat. Now, I was pretty short for my age, but he was a whole head shorter than me, a really tiny guy, but he wasn't some adorable little shorty. Neil was a mean one, and no mistake. You could tell from the glint in his eye and the perpetual smirk on his face. And rumor had it that Neil could be such a bully that he once made a senior guy cry. Nobody really seemed to know exactly how Neil was a bully. Kids just knew to be wary of him and keep away from him, and this resulted in a couple of things. One, Neil had no friends. Nobody wanted to actually spend time with him because he was so unpredictable and supposedly volatile. Now sure, people would be polite to him and nod hello in the halls, but nobody wanted to sit with him at lunch or invite him to social events or anything like that. And two, it meant that some of the more physical bullies had it in mind to take Neil down, and that's where I came in. One day I was sitting alone eating lunch in the courtyard because, like Neil, I also didn't have any actual friends. And so who should come and sit beside me but Neil himself? He asked if I wanted half of his sandwich, and to be honest, it did look really delicious. I really didn't know what to do. Neil, this famous idiot, was offering me food. Was there some catch to it? Like it was filled with razor blades or something? In the end, I decided that I was more scared of what would happen if I said no, so I took the sandwich. And this seemed to make Neil happy, and even more so when I actually ate it. I didn't really know what to say after that, so I just sort of asked him if he was having a good day. Neil ignored my question and told me that he had a proposal for me. Neil basically proposed that I act as his bodyguard, and in exchange, he'd make sure that I wasn't the target of bullies. I told him I wasn't really bullied anymore these days, and he grinned, that sort of snide grin that he had, and pointed out that this was because he had left me alone so far. It was a good point. Neil had never bullied me, and I wasn't sure that I wanted to find out what would happen if he did. And so I agreed to be his friend and bodyguard, and this arrangement somehow lasted all the way to junior year. Neil used me to cause all kinds of trouble. He'd pick on certain kids, really vile stuff, and then have me threaten to fight them, or in most cases, take any blows that would have been aimed at him. Sometimes he'd force me to beat up younger kids, younger than myself, as we got older. In junior year in particular, we saw a few freshman targets that Neil took great delight in having me hurt. Now you may be wondering how Neil managed to have such a hold over me, especially since I wasn't that particularly thin-skinned. Well, Neil managed to find that chink in my armor, my mom. Anytime I tried to push back against Neil or deny him, then he'd throw a barb my way about how my mother had left because of her disgusting fat son and her autistic daughter and her fat R-slur husband. Neil also seemed to know pretty intimate details of the man my mother had run off with and what she was doing now. When I asked Dad about this, he got really quiet and just sort of asked me who I'd heard this from, which was all the answer I needed. Neil was able to use my mother against me quite often. That hurt. It really hurt. And so I took the path of the coward. I chose to hurt other people instead of letting Neil hurt me. And I know this makes me a bad person. I regret all of it. But it is what it is now. And like I said, I'm going to call things as they are, although in this case, yes, I am ashamed of who I was. Neil's influence over me almost ruined my high school career as well. My report cards went steadily downhill. Dad never punished me. He just got kind of sad. One time, he was a little bit drunk and he asked where he was going wrong with me and what he could do to help me to get back on track. And it just about broke my heart. And instead of facing up to that, I said something incredibly mean to him that I still apologize for to this day. I told him he could stop being such an embarrassing loser. Now meanwhile, I developed a reputation at school for being a bully and someone to avoid, so Neil was my only friend really for years. And somehow, Neil managed to twist things so it looked like I was the ringleader and he was my sidekick, so any trouble we got into, it was usually me who took the brunt of it. I remember one time, Neil persuaded me to scratch up the paint on the car belonging to one of the most popular seniors in school. If this guy had caught me, I think he was one of the few people in the school who would actually outdo me in a fight, and he would have pummeled me into the ground. Thankfully, we got away with that one. Towards the end of junior year, Neil developed a crush. The girl in question was an unassuming, bookish girl who was quiet and kept to herself. You know the type. Now, she was also the girl that I'd had a crush on for the last year as well, and I'm pretty sure that Neil knew this. Neil told me that he had a plan to ask her to date him. He just needed some time with her in the art classroom, and I had to stand guard to make sure nobody came along and unlocked the door. Now, I might have been a dumb kid, but I wasn't stupid. I knew that there was absolutely nothing good about what Neil might have planned, and so this one time, I said no. And Neil went nuts. Apparently, there were a lot of things that he'd been holding back, things that he knew about my mom, and according to him anyway, how my stepdad had been abusing my sister. And then he had all this evidence on his phone of my involvement and all the bullying, cut and edited in a way that looked like I was the sole culprit. In particular, there was minutes of footage of me vandalizing the senior's car. Neil threatened to reveal this to them and to reveal to the whole school the kind of loose woman my mother was and how she was allegedly pimping out her own daughter. And at that moment, I saw red. By this point, a lot of my fat had turned into muscle and I had a huge growth spurt. Neil was still tiny. I picked my bully up by the waist. I slammed him down on a table into the empty classroom we were conspiring in. And the crack I heard was almost as terrifying as Neil's screams. I knew I'd done something really, really terrible, something even Neil didn't deserve. And when it all came out, I didn't protect Neil, but I didn't try to protect myself either. I deserved a lot of the blame and I wanted to take it. After this, being sent to a military academy was my own choice. I'd scared myself stupid with my own rage, and I'd hurt people and I'd gotten out of control. Neil's family wanted to press charges, and the military academy also served as a compromise. And this is also how I found out that the man my mother had left the family for was Neil's father. This whole time, my new stepdad was Neil's biological dad who walked out on Neil's family when Neil was just a baby. And I can only guess that the whole thing was intended as some sort of roundabout revenge against me in the end. Military school was the making of me, really. And I took it like a duck to water. I graduated and then joined the military, where I'd stay there to this day. I hate the person I used to be, but I'm proud of the person I've become. And I heard that Neil took a very darker path and never tried to better himself. To a larger extent, I blame myself for this. I certainly see him as a victim in many circumstances. I try to make up for who I was every day. I serve our country, I donate to charity, I send money back to my dad to help my sister's care. Thankfully, Neil's claims of abuse towards my sister were lies aimed to disgrace his dad. Apparently, he's not even that bad of a guy. I don't want to know him, though. I just want to keep making amends for allowing one of the most effed up people I've ever known to dictate, dominate, and destroy my childhood. You may finish this story by hating me and thinking I'm a terrible person, and I wouldn't blame you. But I'm trying. I wish Neil had done the same, and from what I understand, he's done some pretty terrible things in the years since I've known him, and I can only hope that one day he takes his first steps onto the road to redemption that I'm attempting to walk myself. You can't take back the things you do, but you can try and make amends for them, even if it's too little and too late. So a little while ago, I was talking with my 2 teenage granddaughters when the subject of travel came up. One of them suggested that a youthful sense of wanderlust is a relatively new thing, spurred on by cheap flights and Instagram posts depicting influencers in paradise. I agreed with her to an extent. It's easy to develop a thirst for adventure when your feed is filled up with videos of people canoeing between tropical islands or hiking up to Machu Picchu. But I also assured her that wanderlust has existed for as long as people have. I know it's a bit cliched to start giving it the back in my day thing, but it's true. In days of yore, people only needed to look at maps or hear tales of far-off lands to want to board a ship and sail into the unknown. And in my youth, the same was true for me too. My grandkids couldn't believe their sweet old Irish granny had gone off to see the world, especially not all alone. But it was true. And while I told them all kinds of stories from my time in North Africa, the Middle East, and the Indian subcontinent, there was one I saved till they were a little bit older and were of traveling age themselves, because it was one of the most frightening things that I was ever involved with. I left Dublin in 1971 when I was 19. I got a job in London to save some money for the journey ahead, and then used that time to see Buckingham Palace and Big Ben and all of that stuff. From London, I made my way to Paris, where I managed to get a job in a little Irish bar and did the same thing I did in London for a while before moving on to Spain. And Spain was beautiful. All the food was absolutely out of this world, but my original plan was to head to Italy via the south of France. Yet when I got to the Straits of Gibraltar, looked out across the water and saw Morocco just a few miles away, it was like it was calling to me. I could go to Rome and Greece and see all the places I'd seen and read about in history books, or I could head to a place where the people, the food, the music, and the culture were a complete and utter mystery to me. And when I thought of it like that, my mind was made up for me, and off to Morocco I went. I arrived in Tangier after a rough overnight ferry and an even rougher bus ride. I grew up in Dublin, so I thought that I was familiar with the hustle and bustle of a big city, but Tangier made my home city look like a sleepy little village out in the countryside. The second I stepped off the bus at the big central station, there were fellas all around me and the other passengers offering hotels, taxis, hashish, you name it. I had one guy actually try and grab my bag off of me so he could carry it, and I had to shout and bat him away so he'd leave me alone. I don't think he meant anything by it because some of the other wannabe helpers started laughing at him and poking fun in Arabic, but it made for one heck of an introduction to Morocco, and the intensity level never really dropped. The old city was like a sensory overload, a maze of tiny white streets with technicolored washing flapping on lines overhead. Then the marketplaces were absolute bedlam. Sacks of colorful spices were everywhere, with piles of oranges and lemons adding to the medley of all of it. And there were all kinds of shiny copper trinkets and jewelry, then rugs so intricately stitched that I just had to pick one up on the way home. And the whole thing was soundtracked by endless haggling, which only stopped when the call to prayer rang out, loud and haunting, over flat rooftops. The smells were amazing too. Everywhere smelled like cumin, cinnamon, and ginger, and in certain places I smelled this very strong, fragrant, but almost oily smell that I later found out was burning hashish. Now, I got a taste for the sweet mint tea that they drink over there, and my favorite spots to drink were this Cafe Baba up on the hill and Cafe Hafa right on the cliff edge. And at night, the square came alive with acrobats, snake charmers, and storytellers, and I'd head out for a whole meal of tagine or couscous, which back then cost less than $1. Then when I was too tired to keep my eyes open anymore, I'd head back to the hostel that I checked into on my first day I arrived, and I'd catch some sleep before doing it all again the next day. My hostel consisted of 2 dorms, 1 male, 1 female, with each having space for about 12 mattresses. You got a little footlocker to lock things in, and there were communal showers and toilet facilities too, but that was about it. It was a place to rest your head. Nothing more, nothing less, but some heads needed more rest than others. It tended to be those who mixed booze and hash that suffered the worst hangovers, and it wasn't uncommon for me to have to rise, shower, and dress in silence so as not to disturb some very cranky partiers. One night, I came home really late myself to find someone passed out under a blue sheet. Now, I reckon that they'd probably had a little too much and needed to sleep it off, but in the morning, they were still there, covered from head to toe in that blue sheet. As I said, I was used to being extra quiet in the mornings, and so I completed my morning routine with all the energy of a dormouse and then headed out to do some more exploring. Now, I had another amazing day in Tangier, but I wanted to get some of the Marrakesh too, so after visiting the bus station to inquire about ticket prices, I went back to the hostel to take a shower and a siesta before the evening. But then, when I arrived, I saw 2 police cars outside. I eyed them curiously on my approach, and then as I walked into the hostel, one of the officers shouted something to me in Arabic. And while I couldn't understand exactly what he was saying, I figured it was more or less translated to halt. Now, I turned around in time to see the hostel's owner across the way, and it looked like he was comforting one of the other girls that had been staying in the dorm with me. His English was really good thanks to all the tourists and backpackers who came through, so after excusing himself from the girl, I think she was Dutch, he rushed over to explain what was going on. There was a lot of drug smuggling going on in Tangier at the time, with backpackers just like me bringing hash back home to make some massive profits. And while people smoking hash was somewhat tolerated by police, they did not like smugglers. So you'd hear stories from backpackers and being stopped, searched, and sometimes even arrested if they had a large amount of hash on them and not enough cash to pay the bribe. Now, I thought it was something like that because it was mostly solo backpackers, and I obviously fit that profile. But then instead of asking to look through my things, the police started asking me questions about where I'd been the previous night. The owner of the hostel was doing all the translating, so it was a bit slow going back and forth, but they kept asking where I'd been and what I'd done. But most of all, they wanted to know if I'd had any interactions with one of my dorm mates, a French girl whose name had sadly slipped my mind. Now, I think it was Melina or Selena or maybe even Celine, but whatever it was, they wanted to know if we'd spoken and what was said. I told them I'd hardly said a word to anyone I was staying with, and there were girls from all over Europe passing through and staying on those beds, so I didn't even know who they were referring to in the first place. One of the police officers then asked how I'd slept that previous night. I was confused, so after telling them that I slept just fine, I asked why that mattered. The same officer asked if I'd noticed anything the next morning, anything at all about my dorm room. And that's when it hit me. And when it hit me all at once. I've been so programmed for privacy that I didn't see the lump under the blue sheet for what it was. How no one could pass out under a sheet in the Moroccan heat for 9 hours without once getting up to pee or even get a drink of water. Not unless they were dead. I started to panic, realizing that not only had I slept all night with a dead body just feet away from me, but I'd casually showered and dressed without even paying the poor girl a second thought. Then on top of all of that, the police thought I'd killed her. Or at least that's what it felt like when they asked to speak to me down at the police station. It led me away to my car. The hostel's owner was nice enough to come down to the station with me to act as translator, and there I saw a handful of other guests, all sitting on plastic seating in what passed for a kind of waiting room. They didn't put us in cells, although I suppose they could have if they wanted to. They just wanted to ask us some questions, so that's what they did. And I'll be honest, I was distraught when they were asking questions of me. Not so much because I was scared that I'd get the blame for the girl's death, but because I felt so terrible for her. The feeling sorry for myself only lasted a minute or two, then after that I broke for her. They didn't say how she'd been murdered, only that it was a murder. But I suppose from my reaction, they could tell that I wasn't the one who did it. I mean, I was just one of 3 girls who slept near the body that night, but for whatever reason, none of us were considered suspects. None of the guys staying in the hostel got arrested either. And since there were obviously no security cameras, there was no CCTV footage to identify who the girl had been hanging around with before she was killed. The police told us that we couldn't leave the hostel until they'd done some investigating, and us girls asked if there was anywhere else we could sleep. And the owner wouldn't let us sleep in the men's dorm with them, but the guys volunteered to sleep outside in the backyard so that we had somewhere to sleep that wasn't home to a corpse just hours before. A few days later, the police came back and said they'd arrested a suspect, so we were all free to leave Tangier if we wanted to. They wouldn't tell us anything more, only that we weren't suspects. The experience formed a little bond in the group that ended up staying in the hostels after the girl's body was found, and I ended up traveling down to Marrakesh with them. We had a really good time, especially in the daytime when we could do things to distract ourselves. But at night, while we were smoking and drinking, someone would inevitably bring up the girl's murder and things would obviously get quite dark. I still think about that girl sometimes, and being reminded of her through telling my grandkids about her had her on my mind for days and days on end. I told them so they'd know to be careful, so they'd know not everyone out there is just a friend that they haven't met yet. When I was growing up during high school, we had a quiet kid in class. You know the type that I'm talking about. This was post-Columbine, so quiet kid jokes were told, but kind of in a whispered tone. Nobody wanted to actually trigger the quiet kid or generally cause anything really bad to happen, and Kenny never actually showed serious signs of violence. Well, mostly anyway. Occasionally some of the cool kids would give him crap and he'd lash out and sort of yell at them. And whenever he got angry, his voice became incomprehensible, which really didn't help with people calling him an R-word or slow or a prospective danger to society. Now, a few things about Kenny that were actually true. His mom cut his hair in a bowl cut, and the 2000s you'd think that she'd absolutely have to know that this was going to bring the wrath of 1,000 high schoolers down on him. And he also carried a Spider-Man backpack at all times, one from the animated series, and it was before people thought things like this were retro and cool, and so that was another reason people dunked on poor Kenny. He could barely communicate if you spoke to him. He'd spend so long thinking about what you said that it felt like he was almost ignoring you, and you had to learn to just stand there and wait, and eventually Kenny would reply. Most times anyway. Sometimes he really would just zone out, and you'd have to sort of yell his name to snap him back to attention. Now looking back, Kenny shouldn't really have been in school with regular kids, or if he was, he should have had some kind of helper or something. And instead, this probably autistic, probably mentally ill kid was just left to fend for himself in the Thunderdome that is high school. I was so relieved when the new kid, Bradley, joined the school, and he was one of those tall, blonde, wholesome American boys who got along well with pretty much everybody. He excelled at sports, he was smart, the works, and I might have been a little jealous, I gotta admit. And so Bradley became friends with basically everyone in no time, but of all the people he hung around the most, it was Kenny. And I guess you could say that he took him under his wing, but it didn't feel patronizing or protective or anything like that. He really brought Kenny out of his shell. It turns out that when he wasn't ostracized and constantly made fun of, Kenny was actually pretty funny, pretty smart guy. He was deeply intelligent and he was an absolute whiz at chess, and so was Bradley. And Bradley slowly integrated Kenny into various friendship groups. And for his part, Kenny, shockingly, integrated right back. And it was like this strange, unique, beautiful kid had been waiting beneath the surface for someone like Bradley to evolve him, and it was absolutely, utterly tragic that it just couldn't last. Now one day, I came in a little too late to school because I didn't have class first period, and as soon as I got there, I could tell some commotion was going on. Cops were there, and it looked like they were searching lockers, Kenny's locker in particular. I watched as they bagged something up and removed it from the premises, and shortly after that, a sniffling, crying Kenny was marched down the corridor in handcuffs. Now here's the story we were told. Bradley, as his best friend, had discovered that Kenny was planning to dose the food in the school cafeteria with some type of poison. This plan had been underway since well before Bradley joined the school, but instead of making the most of his newfound popularity, Kenny decided to go ahead with it anyway. Bradley had seen the poison in Kenny's locker and, despite his friendship with Kenny, couldn't let this slide and reported it to the school. One kid's dad was high up in the force and kind of snuck a look at the notes on the investigation, and it looked like they didn't have much on Kenny. He was claiming he didn't even know what that substance was. And then Bradley found the manifesto. It had been hidden behind a false wall in Kenny's locker that he had, and Bradley had somehow dug it out, and it detailed Kenny's plan to poison the food and how on the same day he was going to bring 3 pistols to school belonging to his dad and finish anyone off that way. Bradley brought this manifesto straight to the dean, and I guess he really hadn't thought this through. 1, why was Bradley able to access Kenny's locker, find that wall, and discover this manifesto when the cops didn't? 2, Kenny's dad had died many years ago, and while that didn't rule out the idea of him owning guns, he had been a staunch anti-gun campaigner, so the idea of Kenny accessing his father's guns seemed ridiculous. 3, the manifesto was supposedly written before Bradley even came to the school, but the food that Kenny claimed he was going to poison had not been on the menu until that year. Naturally, this made the school authorities and the cops suspicious. Kenny had been suspended from school at the time since there was no actual proof he planned on committing a crime, and then the next thing we knew, Bradley was no longer in attendance either. It turns out Brad was a psychopath who had been kicked out of his last school for antisocial behavior. His father owned an exterminator firm that specialized in killing rats. One of the few remaining uses of that poison is in rat poison. Kenny would not have been able to get his hands on that type of stuff easily. Bradley would have. And eventually, with warrants served, the cops were able to prove that bottles of this stuff were missing from Bradley's dad's inventory. And not only that, they were able to get access to the family computer, and what they found was very damning. A saved file containing the whole manifesto. According to the kid, whose dad was one of the lead detectives, Bradley broke down and sang like a canary. Not a remorseful one, but a proud one. When he arrived at the school and first saw Kenny and heard the quiet kid jokes, he was curious. He wanted to know what kind of punishment would be dealt out to someone who might be a school-based criminal, and he was curious about the effect it'd have on Kenny. Rumor has it that when asked, Bradley coldly admitted that he was curious if Kenny would commit some kind of act against himself. You know what I mean? I don't know exactly what happened to Bradley. He was expelled, but I'm not sure what kind of criminal charges were brought against him. His father doubled down on the misplaced poison having nothing to do with his son, and so we never saw Bradley again. And we never saw Kenny either. The whole incident broke him, and I wish I could say that he'd overcome his experiences, returned to school, and been embraced by us again. I know we would have welcomed him back, but Bradley broke him. Kenny spent the rest of his high school career in some kind of mental institute, and for all I know, he's still there. I've tried to find him a few times, but I've never been successful. And on the chance that you're living your best life, Kenny, and also somehow hear this, I wish you the best. Bradley, you seem to be a psychopath, and I hope you ended up locked away for the safety of everyone. Spending my teenage years around someone like you was the most chilling and horrific thing possible, and the way you tortured poor Kenny is unforgivable. Adults can be awful, but kids can be truly, truly evil. My name's Devin, I'm from Ohio, and I think you could probably shoehorn this story into a video of yours because it's easily the scariest thing that's ever happened to me. So back in 1999, I decided to do a little traveling before college. The Philippines was beautiful, Vietnam was awesome, and Malaysia turned out to have some of the best food I've ever tried. But it was in Thailand that I got a tip from a fellow backpacker, and that tip was to head to Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is this little island off the coast of India, and while it has many of the same flavors as its much larger cousin, it got a very different feel, at least out on the coast it does. The capital, it's called Colombo, and it's sort of like a big human filing cabinet in places. Definitely not my scene, but the little coastal towns were almost like paradise. It was all sun, sea, and surf, and then after deciding it was good enough of a place to spend a week or so, I checked into this little beachside hostel, and that's where I met Mika. Mika was from Finland, and Mika was crazy. Fortunately, I mean that in the best possible way, as in he was probably the most fun-loving, party-going person I had met on all my Asian travels. He was the one who showed me all over Hikkaduwa and where the best food was and where the beer was cheapest and coldest. And he also showed me a place that did some really good iced coffee, something I think I might have lost my entire mind without. He also showed me a place that did good iced coffee, something I think I might have lost my entire mind without. And he also showed me where all the surfer girls liked to party once the sun went down. Now, one morning after waking up, we decided to blast away the cobwebs with a local hangover cure of eggs, and more eggs, with a huge side of red chili sauce. And then when we got back to the hostel, there was someone in our room. The hotel was divided up into maybe 5 different communal rooms, and each one had 3 beds. I met Mika because we were sharing a room, and the 3rd bed had been empty, but when we got back from breakfast, someone had taken it. We had to wait a minute before they returned from using the communal showers, and when they did, a giant walked through the doors to, well, I was going to say greet us, but he didn't. This huge, fat-as-hell red-headed dude walked in wearing nothing but a towel and some flip-flops, and he then gave us some blank stare and then started unpacking the rest of his stuff from some roller case. Mika was the first to say, "Hey man, how's it going?" But he did the same thing. He just sort of looked up, gave us both a blank stare, and then went right back to unpacking in a way that wasn't just rude, it was weird. I gave Mika this sort of look when the fat guy's back was turned, as if to say, what the hell is this guy's problem? But then, after a moment it would look like deep thought, Mika asked the guy, "Ruski?" Only then did the guy speak and say, "Da, Ruski," in reply. It turns out the guy was Russian, and since Finland and Russia share a border, Mika knew enough Russian to explain that he spoke a little before asking the guy's name. I mean, I didn't understand what was being said. I just saw that the guy got very defensive before Mika raised his hands as if to say, "Okay, I'll stop." It turns out when he asked the Russian guy his name, he replied with the Russian equivalent of "none of your business." And then Mika basically asked him what his problem was, and the guy told him to back off, and so Mika did, and then recommended we leave. He filled me in as we walked along the beach towards a bar we like to hang out at, and then he laid out our options over some beers. And by that, I mean what to do about that Russian guy, since he was clearly probably going to be a problem. Mika said if he was a total a-hole, we could just pack up and move hostels. We'd lose out on the days that we'd already paid for, but everywhere was so cheap that it kind of didn't matter if we just pitched up someplace else. But then Mika also said that since the guy was Russian, there was like a 50% chance that he'd end up being chill as hell once he was drunk and figured out that we didn't actually hate Russians. Now, we figured stay one more night, see if he's cool, and if not, then we'd move on. And then we kept on drinking on the beach till the sun had set and it was time for the real party to start. Now, to cut a long story short, we met up with some British girls, who obviously drank like sailors, and then since both me and Mika ended up hitting it off with the 2 of them, he slipped away to his girl's hotel room after wishing me some good luck. Now, my girl and I can't go to her friend's place because they shared a hotel room, so I invited her back to my hostel hoping that the Russian guy wasn't there. But then right as we're trying to get a tuk-tuk, which is kind of like a motorized rickshaw, the British girl starts projectile vomiting into the street. So not to sound mean, but I knew it was a write-off. And so instead of bringing her back to the hostel, I bought a few bottles of water from a nearby store, both for her to drink and to rinse the vomit a little, and then joined her in the tuk-tuk back to our hotel so I could make sure that she got home safe. It was the right thing to do, so that was cool, I suppose, but the real bonus was knowing that Mika's alone time with his British girl was about to get interrupted. It was a nice night for a walk, so I saved a little money by walking the mile or so back to my hostel. But then instead of taking the road, which got kind of sketchy at night, I walked on the beach. The night sky is incredible out there, another reason why I chose to walk instead, but then maybe about halfway through my walk, I see these 2 Sri Lankan guys standing on either side of someone sitting on some lounge chair. And even from a distance, I could tell it was the red-headed Russian. The Sri Lankan guys were standing, but the Russian was almost as tall as them sitting down, like he was this huge lump just sitting there silent while the Sri Lankans were talking among themselves. Now, I'm in a pretty good mood, right? So I see the Russian guy and I say, "Hey, buddy, how's it going?" And then I ask the two Sri Lankans what's going on. They explained that they'd closed their bar for the night, and when they tried to get the Russian to leave, he ended up sitting his butt down in one of their loungers. The same lounge chair that they needed to clean and stack before they could get home for the night. The Russian guy was already a big proponent of blank stares and few words, but when I looked at him, he looked near blackout drunk. His face was all red, eyes bloodshot, kind of panting too, like one of those fat English bulldogs. I remember what Mika said about him maybe being cool, so I took it upon myself to do those Sri Lankan guys a favor by moving him on while befriending him in the process. I tried almost everything except physically pushing him off that lounge chair. But you know what worked in the end? Saying the word vodka to him. His eyes lit up, and then after repeating the word back to me, he hauled himself to his feet and we were on the move. The Sri Lankan guys were very grateful and were yelling, "Thank you, good night," as we walked off. Then, being drunk out of my mind, I started just yapping at the Russian guy in a language he couldn't understand just for fun of it. Now I remember saying, "What's your deal, dude? I bet your parents made you wrestle bears in the circus, because you're built like a freaking tank, aren't you?" Now he didn't say anything in reply. He didn't even look at me. He just kept staggering along the beach at my side as I kept on yapping away. We walked for maybe 5 or 10 minutes, and then the hostel we were staying at came into view. But when the Russian realized that I hadn't taken him towards vodka, he got mad. He turned and then started staggering towards me, saying something in Russian. I told him to chill, that we could get some drinks another time, but nothing stopped him. I didn't think he'd do anything, so when he did, I reacted way too slowly and ended up basically wrestling with a dude who was easily 30 to 40% larger than me. And as you can imagine, that didn't go well. He quickly overpowers me, puts me in a headlock, and then starts smashing the top of my skull with his fist. And his punches hurt like a mother effer, and all the while I'm yelling at him to stop and get off of me, but all he does is keep pounding. I was able to slip out of the headlock with a lot of struggling once he'd tired himself out a little, but I was so drunk that when I did, I immediately fell on my ass again, and when I did, that Russian guy was on top of me with his hands around my neck. I don't think I'll ever forget the feeling of terror for as long as I live. The one I felt when I realized that this wasn't some drunken scuffle anymore, and that if I didn't get his hands off me, I was probably going to die. I tried pulling his hands away by the wrists, but that was no good, and then I tried throwing punches up at him, but nothing that landed seemed to have any effect on him. I kept punching and punching, trying and failing to fill my lungs, and then when they started to burn, I thought, Jesus Christ, man, this is it. This is how I die. I remember trying one last thing where I reach up and started trying to gouge his eye, but still, this Russian guy didn't let go of me. But then just as I was starting to get weak and feel my head start to spin, I heard this voice shouting, "Oi!" and this human missile flies in on the Russian and knocks him square off me. I was still rolling around in the sand, trying to catch my breath, as this voice in some heavily Australian English started yelling, "What's wrong with you, you dog?" And then when I rolled over, I saw 2 of his friends join in, and all 3 of them were built like football players. And one of them starts asking me, "Are you all right, mate? Look like a nasty bit of business. Are you 2 mates or what?" I could barely get a word out, but I managed to rasp out a no, as 2 of the Aussies proceeded to pin this Russian to the sand by sitting on him, while the third said he'd go and get the police. I asked if I shouldn't hang around so I could tell the cops what had happened, but they said that they'd sort it, in their words, and then told me to get myself home and showered to get the sand off me. That's when I realized how covered in it I was. How there was sand in my hair, in my mouth, even my nostrils too. And to this day, I have next to no idea how it all had gotten there. Now, I have no idea what happened to that Russian, if he was arrested, charged, or deported or anything like that, because after telling Mika one hell of a story when he got back later that night, We ended up moving on down the coast the next afternoon. We just didn't want to risk it, you know? There had been enough bad vibes already, so why risk even more of the off chance the Russian managed to skirt his way out of trouble? And the rest of my trip was fine. In fact, nothing like that has ever happened to me since, but even now I still think about what might have happened if those 3 Aussies didn't show up for me, and I'm just as grateful for them today as I was when they first showed up and saved my life. I've been meaning to submit this story to you for a while now. I don't have many scary memories or stories, but there's one that always stuck with me ever since I was a little kid, which is when this happened. I can't remember what state we even lived in at the time, but I know we lived in a small town that felt kind of quaint and pleasant to me. I was probably 3 or 4 when this all happened, so obviously my memories are a bit hazy on the details, but the main plot of the story, I definitely remember it perfectly. I attended this kindergarten in town. It was a pretty small one with maybe 15 little kids, and it was basically what you'd expect. A corner for toys, crappy art on the walls, nap time, a little recess in the yard, and the absolute typical kindergarten. And it would have been completely normal except for the fact that from day one of me attending that school, there was this one strange kid. And we'll just call her Annabelle. She wouldn't join in with the class. She wouldn't read aloud or paint or come outside for recess. She wouldn't do anything except sit in the corner, which everyone referred to as Annabelle's corner. And she didn't just sit there either. Oh no. She sat there making little figures out of Play-Doh and then smashing them with her little fist over and over. Or sometimes she'd pull the limbs off and then the head. Sometimes she'd lie them down and slowly roll the little plastic rolling pin over them. Either way, the end result was that she repeatedly made these Play-Doh people who came to a very sticky end. And from the day I arrived at the kindergarten, I started in the middle of the year because we just moved to the state, the teachers had already taken to ignoring Annabelle and just letting her do what she wanted. She wasn't causing any harm or hurting anyone after all. Naturally, none of the other kids were friends with her. Maybe they tried back in the day, but as far as I knew, they all just ignored the creepy girl in the corner and her Play-Doh playtime. Now, I had a cousin with Down syndrome, and while I could see that Annabelle didn't have Downs, I got it into my head that she had some kind of condition, and it was my duty to befriend her and be nice to her. And so after a couple of weeks of attending the kindergarten and a few more days of building up the confidence, I approached Annabelle in her corner. I was ready for her to just hiss at me or act hostile or ignore me altogether. What I didn't expect was for her to greet me with this big smile, introducing herself and asking me to sit down and suggest that we become best friends. And yet, that's exactly what happened as a little kid. I remember being slightly taken aback, but hey, this was exactly what I'd wanted, right? So I introduced myself too and sat down, and almost immediately, as if she assumed it's what I wanted, Annabelle began showing me how to make the Play-Doh figurines and the various ways in which I could crush them. She didn't explain why we were doing any of this. It was like she figured that I already knew. But she had some particular instructions on how to make what I assumed to be random humanoids. This one had to be short, this one had to have a big nose, and this one needed some big old ears. And it soon became clear that we were making figures of both children and adults. And I'd say that there were maybe an 80-20 split between kids and grown-ups. Now, I went along with this for days because I was just happy that I'd managed to become Annabelle's friend out of all the kids in class. And it took a while for me to ask why we were doing this and what all this Play-Doh violence was for. And the answer Annabelle gave was not something I'd ever heard of before. It was voodoo, she told me. A little kid was talking about voodoo. Now, I'd just like to add here that Annabelle was a Caucasian blonde kid, and as far as I know, she wasn't from anywhere that really practiced voodoo or any sort of religion like that. And I am as convinced as I can possibly be that this wasn't some cultural thing and that she'd heard about the concept from one of her older brothers, of which she had 3, 2 of whom were into horror movies and all sorts of weird stuff like that. And I say this very non-judgmentally because obviously, as a Let's Read fan, I am too. And Annabelle explained what voodoo was to me, which I won't bother recounting because you all know what it is. But the key part here was that we were making these little effigies of our classmates and teachers, and one day, if we were lucky, the gods of voodoo would smile down on us and cause our actions against the dolls to be transferred to the person they represented. I asked Annabelle why we'd even want to do this. Why did we want to hurt our classmates and teachers? And she just looked at me like I was some idiot, actually rolling her eyes and said something like, "Because they're awful, you dummy." I didn't really agree, but the look on Annabelle's face made me feel like I really shouldn't voice that disagreement. Once she explained everything to me, I found out that one of the kids were regularly making dolls of what was another girl, who we'll just call Kirsty. Kirsty was popular, kind of bratty, and I guess I can see why Annabelle disliked her, even though we were just little kids. And the more Annabelle opened up to me too, the more I became to understand her. It seemed like when she first joined kindergarten, the other kids had actually bullied her a bit. I only know this now as an adult, but there was this whole thing with Annabelle's family where they were regarded as pariahs in the town, unfairly for a reason I won't get into, and so the kindergarten teachers had never really bothered to put a stop to the torment. Instead, Annabelle had found out about voodoo one day, and that's what set her on this path. I was torn. I didn't agree that any of the people really deserved to be dismembered or smashed or squished by gods, but I felt sorry for Annabelle too, so I just kind of humored her. And then one day, I noticed Kirsty hadn't been in class for a couple of days, and then the teacher took us aside and told us the bad news, in as sensitive a way as you really could. Kirsty had something called leukemia, a rare kind, and it was very likely that she wouldn't be coming back to school, and we might not see her again. They didn't explain the concept of death to us exactly, and at least in the way that I remember it, that they didn't handle it very well. But the short version is, they told us Kirsty was dying of leukemia. And to me, who didn't really understand how these things work, it felt like it had struck her out of nowhere. Obviously, you can see where my brain went as a kid. One of the gods of voodoo had smiled upon us and given Kirsty leukemia thanks to all the voodoo dolls that we kept making her out of that Play-Doh. And to me, Annabelle and I had effectively sentenced someone to death. And then the next week, my most disliked teacher, Mrs. Malley, slipped in the recess yard and broke her leg. We made voodoo dolls of her a lot too. I liked making those because they were big fat dolls and they were fun to smash and smush and squash, and I didn't like them anymore though. I mulled over everything in my head for a few days. I was the kind of kid who built up internalized trauma real easy. I have no idea why. My parents weren't all that strict and I'd never really been in trouble for anything. But I would feel sick with guilt for days or weeks over the dumbest thing. For example, thinking a swear word silently in my head. And eventually, I'd either move on from it or confess it to my mom, who would inevitably just tell me not to worry about it. Now this time though, I was certain that I was right to worry about it, and I didn't think it was my mom that I needed to confess to, but our main kindergarten teacher. And so one recess I went inside and told her everything, how me and Annabelle had making voodoo dolls and that we'd given Kirsty leukemia. And then we hadn't stopped there, and we'd broken Mrs. Malley's leg. Now here's where I think the teacher really messed up, whose name I genuinely forget despite how many years I'd spent angry at her. Now she must have been able to tell that I was sincere. She must have. I was crying and struggling to get the words out. I was clearly having a really hard time, but instead of gently explaining to me that this isn't how things work, that you can't create voodoo dolls out of Play-Doh and give classmates sicknesses, and that you can't make Miss Malley break her leg, this teacher screamed at me. She told me I was disrespecting Kirsty and Mrs. Malley, and that I was being a horrible little child, and she was seriously considering calling my parents in. I think the only reason she didn't was because she knew that she'd handled that badly, and she shouldn't have let her anger control how she reacted to me. Now, of course, This all made me feel really totally awful, so I vented to my only friend, Annabelle, and then as soon as I had, I realized I just admitted to Annabelle that I'd ratted her out as well. And so then I started apologizing deeply for that too. And Annabelle just sat there in silence for a while, like she was thinking really hard. I kept talking, suggesting that maybe we should just make a voodoo doll of the teacher because the gods would definitely smile on us this time. And eventually Annabelle just shook her head and asked me if I really was sorry that I tried to rat her out. Now, repeatedly, I insisted. I told her I'd do anything to prove it. And Annabelle just kind of smiled and she said she had an idea. We wouldn't make a voodoo doll of the teacher. Instead, there were other ways to do the voodoo god's bidding, and I could prove my support and love at the same time. Now, the next day, she showed me the means of our revenge. It wasn't anything really complex, and it wasn't some elaborate voodoo ritual. Instead, Annabelle had a huge kitchen knife in her backpack, and she wanted me to take the knife, come into the classroom when the teacher was alone at recess, and stab her 16 times. This, apparently, would make amends both to the gods and to Annabelle. Now, the story has probably illustrated that I was a pretty naive kid, and it probably makes it clear that I'm neurodivergent myself, but nothing, in no way, would have convinced me that taking Annabelle's huge knife and stabbing our teacher repeatedly was okay. And instead, it made me realize that Annabelle was some bloodthirsty psychopath who had a capacity for violence as a freaking kindergartner. Now, I know this because when I refused and told her there was no way that I was going to stab the teacher, Annabelle pulled a pair of small sewing scissors out of her backpack and stabbed me in the leg with them. It wasn't a little poke either. It was a deep, rough stab that caused blood to start gushing from my thigh. Obviously, I began to scream, and then so did a bunch of other kids when they saw the bleeding. As soon as it clicked in her brain what she'd done, I think Annabelle just gave up. She pulled the kitchen knife from her backpack and lunged at me. However, thankfully, she was just some little girl, and our teacher was not, and she was able to grab Annabelle from behind and very easily pull the knife away from her. I had to go straight to the hospital, so I didn't get to see the aftermath. My parents shielded me from most of it too, but what I do know is that Annabelle had to spend some time in an institution and even receive some serious therapy. There are things my parents still won't tell me about the aftermath, even though I'm in my first year of college at this point, so I can only assume that something pretty bad or tragic or both ended up happening with Annabelle. We moved away to a totally different state right after this, and of course, it's not like you could just Google for news stories about a mentally ill little kid. Now, really all I know is that for a couple of months, my best friend at kindergarten was a potential killer who believed that she could do magic, and also that I was extremely lucky not to get killed. And that's the part that I don't like to think about. Whenever I tell this story, I try to play it off like I was some badass hero dodging knife swings and surviving some murderer. And it's the only way that I can really stay sane. I know that if I start thinking about it too hard, I'll just dwell on what could have happened, and I refuse to do that. And so this is my story. It could have been a lot worse, but the fact that it wasn't and the fact that I'm still here to tell the story is something I'm going to focus on above anything else. When I was younger, in high school, I admit that I was a bit of a stoner, a sort of emo goth type who probably didn't take care of herself that well and smoked a little too much weed. Now, this was before weed was legal too, so we couldn't just walk to the store and pick some up. We'd spend our weekends hanging out in this sort of cubby hole under a bridge, not like the one from that famous dancing video you probably remember, and we'd turn it into a bit of a hangout space. Rugs, magazines, a battery-powered stereo, the works. Now, one rule was if you showed up, then you brought snacks. And there was one guy who didn't follow that rule, or any of them really, and his name was Birmingham. And that wasn't really his real name. I imagine that, but that's what he insisted we call him. Because get this, He'd been to Birmingham in England once on a vacation for like a month, and there were a bunch of ways Birmingham didn't fit in. He wasn't a goth or emo, he was more of a hippie, and he was this white dude with dreadlocks, although I'm not sure if they were dreads or whether his hair was really just that unkempt. Birmingham would never arrive with snacks either, and he'd never contribute free stuff to the den. He'd just stroll in and hang out while the rest of us put the work in. And while some of us might not have the best kind of hygiene, Birmingham had absolutely reeked of BO, and whoever got stuck sitting next to him, usually one of the girls, would have to develop a tolerance to his smell. Oh, and did I mention that Birmingham was 32? A 32-year-old stinking hippie hanging out with high school goths and emos, and he was not shy about hitting on some of the girls in the group. So, you're probably asking, why did we tolerate him? And the answer was simple. We were young, dumb, and he would buy us alcohol and provide us with weed. For a price, mind you, which he made no secret about skimming a profit from. He'd just shown up one day, told us that he could hook us up just as we'd been wondering how the hell to get into substance abuse. Spoiler, just don't. And he sort of just stuck around ever since. And so Birmingham, despite all of his flaws and age gap and being a creep, was very much always at our hangout. He acted like he was the king of the castle when we were his adoring servants, especially the women. Even though all of us resisted his quote-unquote charms, he behaved as if we constantly lusted after his stinky-ass body. He was gross, to put it mildly, and we were dumb enough to let him stick around anyways. And there were maybe 8 of us, including Birmingham, on and off, 4 girls, 3 high school guys, and this Birmingham guy. 2 of the guys were far too of losers to really ever stand up against him, and one of them was as much of a predator creep as Birmingham was. So between Birmingham and this other weirdo, whose name was Josh, us girls really had to watch ourselves. We just moved into junior year when Birmingham ramped up his behavior. He singled out a couple of the girls, they were named Sandy and Bridget, and started trying to get them to engage in some really strange actions with him. At first, he offered free joints in exchange for this, and then it was an entire free baggie of weed, and then it was weed and unspecified pills. He must have been really desperate to get touched, as that's all he was aiming for, to start with anyway. And a rumor went around that Sandy did actually give in and even did some strange stuff with him for a bag of weed, and we didn't see her for about a week. And when she came back to the group, she seemed down and ashamed and wouldn't look anyone in the eye, and we got the impression that whatever experience she'd had with him had not been a good one. And knowing how pressurizing Birmingham could get, I could only imagine. Now, none of us wanted to bring it up with Sandy in case it wasn't that, but behind her back, most of the boys were not sympathetic, especially Josh, while obviously the girls felt bad for her. And we began talking about how to get rid of this Birmingham, but the boys were having none of it. He was our free ticket to weed and alcohol, and we weren't losing that just because Sandy wanted a freebie. These little assholes. I'm not going to pretend Sandy was innocent in this whole affair, but if you knew Birmingham, you'd know how far he'd tried to go to get what he wanted. And the fact that it had taken until now was a miracle. The thing that changed everything was when this new girl joined junior year and quickly became a member of our group. Her name was Summer, and ironically, she had almost jet black hair, completely natural, and she soon became one of us, and Birmingham was smitten, and so was Josh. This was the first rift. Summer was one of those girls who was confident and she dressed provocatively, but she had no interest in doing anything with a dude. And so began a competition between Josh and Birmingham to be the first one to get Summer without clothes. They weren't trying to sleep with her, not yet anyway. They just made a bet to be the first one to consensually see her. And the consensual part wasn't out of respect or anything, it was just for bragging rights between these 2 weirdos. Naturally, Summer didn't appreciate this from the start, having 2 guys, one of whom was literally 32 and stank, trying to get her to do something like flashing, and she began asking some of us privately why we tolerated this weirdo, and so we explained. And then she asked why we tolerated Josh, and we started realizing that there really wasn't actually a good reason for that. He was a creepy idiot too, but he normally targeted girls outside the group. There were all sorts of rumors circulating about the way he'd treated past girlfriends. Summer decided she'd try to handle it, and her solution was to offer some kind of vague incentive to Josh or Birmingham, to whichever one beat the other in a fight. And very clearly beat, no question that they'd won, i.e., she meant one of them to put the other in the hospital. Summer had expected them to say no, that it wasn't worth it, but apparently this high school boy and this 32-year-old man were willing to risk killing each other over seeing some girl's body, and so it was decided that the fight would be that Friday night. Summer had become my personal best friend, really, so she was panicking to me on the telephone about this. And of course she didn't want anyone to get hurt, she just wanted both of them to just screw off. We couldn't think of any solutions other than to try and de-escalate the fight or call the cops if we really had to. And ultimately, none of that needed to happen. We all showed up to the hangout on Friday. Birmingham made some disgusting, crude comment about how he was going to win the fight and Summer would be compelled to do all sorts of unspeakable things. And that's when he attacked. Only the attack didn't come from Josh. Now remember I said the other two guys who were too much of babies to ever stand up against Birmingham? Well, it turns out that wasn't true. One of them, a guy named Craig, suddenly went flying across the room, slamming Birmingham against the concrete wall of the hangout and pinning him there by the throat. Craig was a big guy, tall and large, and he had no problem holding this skinny, wiry Birmingham guy in place. And it all came out. How much we all hated Birmingham, and how he was a stinking, vile parasite who could only get with women by trying to bribe children with drugs. How none of us could stand him, basically everything we'd ever wanted to say to him. You see, we found out later that Craig had been developing a burning, powerful crush on Summer, and the more Birmingham and Josh talked about her like that, the more quietly and fuming he got. And then he just snapped. We watched in silent awe as Craig headbutted Birmingham square in his nose, audibly breaking it, and we listened as he threatened to gut him violently if he ever showed his face around the hangout again, or even around town. And then he pulled the hunting knife out of his belt. That's the exact moment Josh walked in, looking sick and nervous, presumably for his fight. You'd expect this to distract Craig, but it didn't. He held the knife up to Birmingham's throat so tightly that it drew beads of blood and told him how serious he truly was. And then Craig dropped some info we didn't know. He mentioned the name of his family, a well-known Irish-American gang in town who were, to say the least, serious business. And when Birmingham heard that, that's what finally broke him. He began to cry, begging forgiveness and apologizing to Craig. And Craig said it wasn't him who deserved the apology, it was Summer. And Summer just shook her head and said she didn't care, she just wanted this guy out of there. So Craig let him limp away, and that was the last we ever saw of that creepy drug dealer again. Now meanwhile, Josh had been watching the whole thing with a sort of sick look on his face, as I said, and Craig turned to him, tucked the knife back into his belt, and just gave him this look that sort of said, "You could be next." And the group kind of dissipated after that. Nobody really had the energy to hang out with each other with all that violence hanging in the air, and Summer and I stayed friends, and the other girls and guys sort of drifted away. We're still friends to this day, and sometimes Summer and I talk about how we were regularly hanging out with 3 different guys who were scary in their own way. And there was Josh, who I later found out got kicked out of college for his conduct with a female student. And then there was Birmingham, who, looking back, was more terrifying than I truly realized. An adult male trying to use intoxicants to get underage women into bed with him. And while he was maybe the least dangerous, Craig was definitely the scariest. Nothing suggested he'd explode that day, and nothing gave away that he was the black sheep of an extremely violent family. And all we can be grateful for is that Craig's first outburst of rage was directed at the right target. I know people like to fall asleep to your videos, but I have a story that sometimes still gives me nightmares to this day. I don't know why it creeped me out so much that as an adult I still sometimes have night terrors and sleep paralysis that revolve around it, but hey, I guess it takes all sorts to scare us. Now this story wasn't a serial killer or a gunman or a home invader or anything like that. The scary thing here was a little girl I grew up with. Her name was Bethany, and we grew up together, and we were supposedly best friends. At least, that's what our respective parents insisted anyway. Now, this is going to make me sound like an idiot, but the truth is that I was Bethany's best friend, but she wasn't mine. Now, before you write me off, though, stick with me. I was Bethany's best friend because even from an early age, she didn't have any other friends. The reason for this is because she weirded all the other kids out. None of the other kids in the neighborhood, girls or boys, would play with her. She scared them with her odd behavior and the strange things that she would say about ghosts and witches and all tons of nonsense. Mostly, though, she had this habit of hiding in places and then jumping out and yelling at you to scare you. Other little kids don't really like that, and since Bethany made, quote, freaking our friends out her entire personality, they didn't really like Bethany either. Unfortunately, Bethany's parents and my parents were best friends. They made a group since college, and they stayed very, very close ever since, and they both had their first kids, me and Bethany, in the same year. We were born just about 1 month apart, and so our parents decided that we were destined to be best buddies, just like they were, and ever since we were tiny little babies, we were forced into being a pair. Now, Bethany took this rule of friendship very seriously, and that meant that she stuck to my side like glue, and as a little kid, I had no hope of having any other real friendships when Bethany was always there, creeping everyone else out and behaving like a total weirdo. She was also insanely protective and jealous of me, so any chance I might have had at establishing other friendships basically went out the window. Bethany just seemed to have no shame and no sense of decorum or restraint. She'd pull weird faces at other kids, and she had no hesitation about breaking wind or burping in front of anyone. She'd say extremely hurtful things to other kids, calling larger kids fatty and that kind of thing. And as we moved through elementary school, her vocabulary developed into calling people various slurs, usually things that just made no sense and didn't even apply to them. And the fact that I was associated with her as her best friend, it was an embarrassment and absolutely destructive thing to any social life that I might have had. If I even tried to bring up the topic with my parents, they acted like I was being so mean because Bethany was a little angel, and they just wouldn't see the fact that she was some creepy weirdo. The one strange exception to Bethany's behavior was church. Both of our families were Christians and we attended the same church. And in church, Bethany was like a totally different person. It was as if God genuinely calmed her and soothed some kind of devil in her. Thankfully, the kids at Sunday school mostly weren't the same kids from our neighborhood or our elementary schools, so we did actually have some other friends there. It was so strange. And to this day, I have no idea if Bethany was putting on some act in church or she really did just feel compelled to be her best self. Church is important to the story too because it introduces the other main characters here. Marie, our babysitter from when we were really little. Our parents would frequently go out for meals or go to see the movies on Friday or Saturday nights, and Marie was their choice of babysitter from the get-go. I think she first started babysitting us when she was 14 and we were 5 or 6, old enough for our parents to feel comfortable leaving us with someone else. When everything ended, we were 12, so I guess Marie was 20, although she'd never gone off to college or anything like that. Marie would also babysit us at Bethany's house. There were various reasons for this, but mostly, Bethany had difficulty falling asleep anywhere but her own bed, and our parents would often be out long after it was time for us to go to bed. Bethany had this game where she tried to act as creepy as possible whenever Marie babysat us, but without Marie ever finding out. Somehow she managed this for 6 years. I don't know if Marie was just completely oblivious and unobservant, or if Bethany was incredibly clever and manipulative. Bethany had 3 different games that she played around Marie. One was the creepy sound game. Bethany would hide somewhere in the house and make a loud clicking sound with her throat, kind of like that ghost from The Grudge, and then if Marie heard, she'd convince her that she had no idea what was actually making the sound. I even heard Marie talking about it to Bethany's parents once, asking if they'd ever heard this strange noise. They hadn't, of course, because Bethany behaved like an angel around adults. And the second game was trying to make me jump and scream, and if she succeeded, I had to tell Marie that I'd seen a spider or a mouse because just like any other time I tried to push back against Bethany, she threatened to make my life a living hell. I did not want to find out what kind of horror Bethany would plan for me if she ever decided that I wasn't her best friend, so I just went along with everything that she threw at me. Finally, the third game was called Goblin. Bethany had this thing where she'd pretend to be a goblin, but it was honestly uncanny. She managed to sort of scuttle along the ground on all fours, pulling this genuinely horrifying face. She'd hide under beds or climb up on cabinets or wardrobes and act as demonic as she possibly could. And you know how people use that phrase, goblin mode? I'm convinced it was invented by someone who knew Bethany. And the way she turned this into a game was going goblin mode for as long as she could without Marie or other adults ever catching her. One time, I remember her crouching in the corner of the living room, putting her goblin face on while Marie watched television, and she managed this for an entire hour before getting bored and making me play some board game with her. As we grew up and moved from elementary school to middle school, I really thought, or at least hoped and prayed, that Bethany would grow out of her weird, creepy phases. Instead, they just got worse. Middle school presented her with a whole new group of kids to alienate and freak out. Thankfully, middle school allowed me to make a few other friends and vent to them about how much Bethany drove me crazy and how embarrassing I found her. It wasn't much, but word did start getting around that I was more than Bethany's sidekick and didn't actually approve of or endorse her rude, vulgar, and insulting behavior. And this was especially relieving as she was going through her constantly saying slurs era, usually based on nothing and totally unrelated to the person that she was hurling that slur at. I can't give examples without getting this video demonetized, obviously, but for example, imagine a slur aimed at a homosexual man being used against an 11-year-old girl, or a little white boy being called, well, you can imagine the kind of things. Now, once again, she just wanted to be as weird and off-putting as possible, and I was starting to get really sick of it. Our parents showed no signs of drifting apart, which meant that Bethany and I were being forced to spend almost every weekend together. Nearly every Friday, they would go out to dinner with a group from church and wouldn't return home until it was well past midnight, so I would have sleepovers at Bethany's house almost every single Friday, and it was hell. Now, I wanted to start hanging out with my other friends and living a life of my own. I could tell something had changed with Bethany on the Friday that this all kicked off, but I couldn't put my finger on it exactly. She was sort of aloof with me, acting as if she didn't care that I was there, when normally she'd behave like a hyperactive child whenever we had a sleepover. Our parents had been gone for a few hours and Marie was downstairs doing some kind of homework, so I guess she must have been attending some kind of school thinking about it. And maybe she was doing college remotely, I have no idea. No, anyway, Bethany had told me she wanted some alone time and left me in the living room watching TV, but eventually she told me to come upstairs to play Scrabble. Bethany loved Scrabble because she'd make up words and insist that they were real, so she always won. Now, she also enjoyed putting rude words down on the board. When I went upstairs, the Scrabble game wasn't set up, and instead, Bethany was sitting at her desk, fingers poised like Mr. Burns from The Simpsons. And she stared at me for what felt like minutes and then finally spoke and told me that she'd heard from a little birdie that I'd been saying mean things about her at school behind her back. Now, at first, I had no idea what she was talking about, but then I realized. I had disavowed her behavior and bitched about her to other kids. And while I don't think anyone ratted me out to Bethany, I think she overheard some kids defending me or saying that I wasn't as bad as my weird friend or something like that. Bethany said that she knew that I'd been calling her a weirdo and telling other kids that I didn't like her, so there was no point in denying it, and if I tried, then she'd make things worse. And then her face split into this really creepy grin, and she told me that it didn't matter. We were still best friends, and if I promised to stay loyal to her from then on, she'd forgive me. Of course, being terrified of her and lacking much of a backbone, I begged her forgiveness and promised that I'd stay best friends with her. And for the rest of the night, Bethany constantly played two of her favorite games. She'd disappear off and make the weird grudge sound, which Marie had started ignoring years ago, and then she would constantly jump out at me from places to scare me. This time, though, the game changed. I wasn't allowed to scream or let Marie know that I was scared. This was now suddenly part of the terms of her forgiving me for insulting her. I think I pulled it off really well. If I hadn't stressed it enough, Bethany could be incredibly creepy, and she managed to squeeze into the most impossible hiding spots and jump out from the craziest areas. I think I must have stifled well over 20 screams that night, determined not to invoke whatever hypothetical anger she threatened me with. No, I was just grateful that she didn't decide to combine it all with her goblin impression. I'm not sure that I could have handled seeing Bethany scooting across the floor out of nowhere that night. I was already jumpy enough as it was. Now, eventually, it was our bedtime, so we headed to our respective bedrooms. And that was one of the things that I did like about sleepovers at Bethany's. They had a guest room, and when I slept over, I was able to use it. Our parents didn't like the idea of us keeping each other up by talking all night, and was a rule that I was more than happy to follow now. And I guess the bedroom also had a lock, and due to Bethany's love for scaring me, I'd always locked it before I went to sleep ever since I was young. It had given me a degree of safety, but I found out that night it was completely misplaced. Bethany had always had a key to my room, I suppose, and simply waited for the right time to use it. I had no idea what had woken me up. I blinked in the darkness, trying my best to let my eyes adjust, and then I heard it again. Bethany's stupid, croaking ghost noise. And that's when I realized where she was. She was standing on the wooden footboard of the bed, balancing there in some bizarre crouch. Her face was full goblin mode, and she'd done something to her hair to make it stick up everywhere. I reached out and turned on the lamp and saw the full creepy weirdness of Bethany's goblin mode. She was dressed only in her underwear, and she'd written all sorts of strange words and symbols all over her body in what looked like lipstick. When she smiled, I saw that her teeth was also covered in lipstick too. And then she spoke in this weird goblin voice, and I'll never forget what she said.
"Do you think I'm weird enough now?"
And with that, she leaped off the foot of the bed and landed on me. And then she began smearing something on my face, which I later found out was the same lipstick that she'd used to write on herself. And at the same time, she kept spitting on me, saying she wanted to make me weird like her. I managed to scream, but I think Marie must have heard the commotion already, as she came bursting into the room, and then I heard her screaming. My first thought was that my savior had shown up to finally protect me from Bethany's insanity, but I could never have predicted how Marie would interpret the situation. At first, all she did was scream at us to break it up, and then she made Bethany put on a robe, march us both downstairs, and had us sit on opposite chairs in the living room until all 4 of our parents returned home. When Marie told them what had supposedly happened, I couldn't believe my ears. According to her, she'd caught us engaging in some kind of carnal act, that she could no longer be around 2 girls who would behave like that. And the worst part is, Bethany claimed that this was also true, that we'd been drawn to each other and needed Jesus. As my parents took me home that night in shame, I begged and pleaded with them to believe me that this wasn't what happened. I was way too young to even be thinking about anything like that, let alone with Bethany. And they said nothing as I talked over and over about how Bethany had always tried creeping me out ever since we were little kids, how the other neighborhood kids couldn't stand her, and how she alienated and ostracized everyone at school, how she would say terrible words and acted disrespectfully. I told them that, and I thought Bethany needed help, serious help. Eventually, thank God, they believed me, and yet somehow this didn't make things any better. But you see, her parents believed me too, but the help they decided that she needed was some kind of camp for wayward teens rather than the therapy and support that I'd had in mind. And so Bethany was shipped off to what I later found out was a particularly notorious wilderness survival camp designed to scare kids straight into good behavior. And they kept Bethany there for over a year. And then when she came home, she didn't want to see anyone. She was homeschooled. She wanted to avoid me and everyone else. Our parents had remained friends during the whole ordeal of Bethany being at the camp, but as soon as she returned, they kind of just stopped spending time together. And the whole thing conflicts me so much. Bethany terrified me and emotionally hurt and scared a lot of people, but I never wanted her to have her entire personality stripped out of her or be forced to become the shell of herself that camp seemed to have turned her into. Eventually, I heard from my parents that Bethany had decided to dedicate her whole life to Jesus, and after graduation was set to become a nun. And as far as I know, that's exactly what ended up happening. She has no social media presence, and it's not like she had any other friends that could ask. We lost touch with her parents years ago, and now she's a very strange, eerie footnote in my life. But like I said, sometimes I have these nightmares where she crawls after me on all fours, going full goblin mode, furious at me for the path that I set her on. And sometimes I wake up with sleep paralysis and I see Bethany standing there on the foot of my bed, just like she was on that final night. Only now she isn't just contorting her face to look like a goblin. In these sleep paralysis fits, she looks fully demonic. And whenever I finally break out of them and the specter of Bethany seems to disappear, I find myself wondering, did I possibly make things better for my weird best friend, or did I simply make them much, much worse? Hey friends, thanks for listening. Don't forget to hit that follow button to be alerted of our weekly episodes every Tuesday at 1 p.m. EST. And if you haven't already, check out Let's Read on YouTube, where you can catch all my new video releases every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. EST. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you in the next episode.